If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 1. Before she'd turned 2, Tanya could hold fire in the palm of her hand. Unlike her first death, when she'd argued with that insufferable being X, Tanya could not recall the details of her second death quite so easily. She'd been on a high-risk mission, and remembered flashes of the scowl on that hate-filled zealot Mary's face as she fired round after round at her, each shot laying waste to the city beneath as they rampaged through the sky. Had Mary dealt her a killing blow? Or had she collapsed with exhaustion and plummeted to her death after the battle? Tanya wasn't sure, but without the benefit of seeing time frozen around her, her memories of her final moments were hazy. Although perhaps final wasn't quite the right word, because after awakening from what felt like a very long slumber once again, Tanya found herself reincarnated for a third time. The world was different, though in what was doubtlessly a poor attempt at irony, Tanya's life story was strikingly similar to her previous incarnation. She had been born into a world at war, the daughter of a common soldier who she assumed had perished in the conflict, and whose mother had quickly decided she was not ready to handle the responsibilities of parenting alone. Thus mere days after her birth she had been left in the care of a religious orphanage. Once she had gained a fine enough control of her motor functions to explore, Tanya set about gathering information about her latest world. Her first guess that she had been born into a section of Imperial Japan that really loved the color red had proven close, but not entirely accurate. This world was divided into 4 nations, and her new homeland called itself the Fire Nation. It was a militaristic empire ruled by a figure known as the Fire Lord, and though the technology in this world was sadly far behind the previous worlds she'd inhabited, the Fire Nation was at least the most technologically advanced of the 4, boasting metal ships, tanks, and the beginnings of other marvels of military engineering. The Fire Nation had instigated the current war nearly 100 years ago, and if the propaganda available at her orphanage was to be believed, it was set to win in the next decade or so. Speaking of her orphanage, Tanya's new home was the Cerulean Orphanage, an extension wing of the High Temple in Capital City. The organization who ran it were a strange group that called themselves the Fire Sages. Tanya had at first believed it was an on-the-nose reference to the name of her nation, but had soon been proven wrong after witnessing a fascinating sight. Firebending. She'd only been a few months old when she'd first seen it. Although the Fire Sages were responsible in theory for running the orphanage, in practice their involvement was in organization only. The ones who did the majority of the work were the nuns. There was one sage though, a relatively young and mousy-looking man named Hazar, who would occasionally drop by to entertain the children with stories about legendary heroes who commanded flames and fought dragons. Tanya had been listening half-heartedly to one such story when, out of nowhere, Hazar had decided to emphasize his story about how mighty the dragon's roar was by tilting his own head back and mimicking it. When a genuine jet of sparkling red flames had shot out of his mouth, she had fallen off her chair in surprise. Soon it became clear that the 4 nations were named for more than just their preferred color schemes. Some people in the Fire Nations possessed the power to telepathically manipulate fire through the act of moving their bodies in controlled movements reminiscent of ancient martial arts. Once Tanya had mastered speaking with her new mouth, a few quick questions revealed that members of the other nations could manipulate their named elements in much the same way. Once she'd discovered this, a new question had popped up in Tanya's mind. Was she a firebender? It was no great secret that all firebenders were conscripted into military service as soon as they were able, and it was definitely being X's style to grant her a curse disguised as a blessing. Just like he'd given her great magical power in her previous life, knowing that it would force her to fight at the front lines, had he given her the power to firebend in this life, knowing it would force her into the war once again? Though logically she knew the best option would be to never uncover whatever talents being X may or may not have given her, resisting the urge to try it proved a surprisingly tough challenge. Something in her chest, something hot and powerful not dissimilar to the feeling of mana, ached whenever she was near a naked flame, bringing with it a longing to reach out and touch it. She did well resisting the urge for as long as she did, but a few weeks before her second birthday the temptation proved too much. She'd been alone in the library, reading a book of the history of the world in the candlelight, and had let her guard down. Her breathing had slowed, unknowingly rising and falling with the faintest flickering of the candle, and before she knew it the beauty of the tiny little flame had transfixed her. She reached out, plucking it from the candle wick as easily as picking a grape from a vine, and levitated it above her finger as she gazed deep into it, not even questioning how the flame did not fade away without fuel. A sharp gasp snapped her back to reality, and Tanya snuffed the flame in the palm of her hand as her eyes shot upwards. One of the Fire Sages was watching her with wide eyes, his expression caught between surprise and awe. Whatever hopes she'd had of dismissing it as a trick of the light were quickly shattered as the sage scooped her up into his arms and took her to see the head sage. While firebenders were not uncommon, most children did not discover their gift until the age of 5 or later. Those few who discovered it earlier were hailed as prodigies, but even among them it was unheard of for anyone to discover their gifts at the age of 1. And so it was that, much to her great annoyance, Tanya was singled out as a genius among geniuses, and began private lessons with the fire sages in the art of firebending at the tender age of 2. Whether she liked it or not, the path to becoming a master firebender had been thrust upon her. A path that would doubtlessly lead into the battlefields once again. Chapter 2. Before she'd turned 6, Tanya had earned herself a reputation. That year news had been abound that this year's Crouching Dragon tournament was the one to watch. The Crouching Dragon was an annual event where the firebending children of nobility and other influential figures battled it out in mock duels to demonstrate their strength. While it seemed barbaric to Tanya to make children blast jets of fire at each other for entertainment, she at least understood the unspoken reason behind it. In this country, skill at firebending was valued higher than anything else. Higher nobility boasted of bloodlines that had never failed to produce firebending children, and the achievements of firebending masters were celebrated far more than that of doctors, engineers, or non-bender soldiers. There was a direct, strong correlation between one's skill as a firebender and the respect afforded to them, so of course the political elite would be chomping at the bit to show off their progeny as a future firebending master at the earliest opportunity. Agila, the granddaughter of Fire Lord Agilan, and a prodigy who'd awakened to her firebending at the age of 4, had been relentlessly training under the finest tutors the imperial court had to offer for the past year, and this tournament would be the first public demonstration of her exceptional skill. At age 5 she was now able to compete in the tournament's youngest age bracket, alongside many children who'd only just discovered their abilities, and public opinion was that she was expected to dominate it. Rumor had it that she was daring, focused, and utterly ruthless when she had a goal in mind. It was clear that Prince Ozai intended for this tournament to be her debut into high society, a demonstration of the natural talent members of the royal family were blessed with. So Tanya was slightly concerned that she was being entered as well, and into the same age bracket no less. As representative of the fire sages, High Sage Ignis was granted a seat amongst the high nobility at the tournament and other such political events, and as such reserved the right to enter a contestant of their own. The fire sages rarely entered the wards in their care into these sorts of events due to their notoriously lackluster performances, though it seemed they had higher expectations for Tanya. The High Sage had plundered the High Temple's already strained budget to hire a luxurious palanquin equal to the kind the nobility used, which he and Tanya now sat in as they were transported to the tournament grounds. Judging by the ever-growing noise of the crowd outside, they must have only been a few minutes away. "Remember your breathing, Tanya," Ignis advised in his usual monotone manner. "Breath is the core of firebending. Many allow the pressure of the crowd to break their nerves and shallow their breathing, weakening their flames. Whatever happens, you must keep your breath deep and steady." "Yes, High Sage," Tanya dutifully replied, bowing her head slightly in acknowledgement and respect. Though she held little love for religions in general, she held a deep appreciation for a clear and efficient chain of command. "I will represent the fire sages to the best of my ability. You will represent us by winning, Tanya. I expect nothing less than absolute victory." A slight frown tugged at the corners of Tanya's mouth. "Sir, given the political importance of Agila's entry into this contest, might it not be wise to allow her the ultimate victory? Prince Ozai is an influential man, and has made no secret of his intention to use this tournament as a way to formally introduce his daughter to the public. Assuming that I could beat her, would doing so really be wise? It could turn the royal family's ire against us for years to come." Ignis snorted disdainfully. "Bah! What of it? Ozai has no respect for the importance of the sages. At every turn he scorns and mocks us. Perhaps knocking his precious progeny down a peg or two will remind him to show respect to Agni every once in a while." Warning sirens started blaring in Tanya's mind. Not good. Not good at all. This sounded eerily like a personal vendetta, exactly the kind of spite-fueled drama that was a nightmare for any human resources manager. The fire sages wanted to embarrass Prince Ozai and his family for nothing more than petty vengeance, and as their tool for doing so the royal family's retaliation would surely be directed at her too. Relationships with influential individuals could make or break a person's career, and the Fire Lord's family were the most influential people in the world. Souring any chance of a positive relationship with them was a fine way to guarantee an eternity stuck as a common foot soldier on the front lines. "We need you to win, Tanya," Ignis continued, unaware of her inner turmoil. People have begun to forget the old ways the longer this war drags on. They forget to show the spirits the respect they are due, and us the respect we are due as their spokespersons. Today you will prove that even a peasant child like yourself can defeat those of noble lineage through the spiritual guidance and teaching of the fire sages, and the people will see proof of our importance once again. For it is right and proper that the sages should guide the people in their. Tanya zoned out as Ignis launched into another ramble about the importance of spiritual guidance, and her mind quickly kicked into overdrive to work out a solution to the problem she'd found herself forced into. Had this been what the fire sages had intended for her when they began her training almost 4 years ago? To become a poster child for their bid to become relevant to society again? How irritating! This was the political equivalent of being between a rock and a hard place, unable to act without making an enemy of a powerful institution that could drastically change the direction of her career. Was it possible to win the tournament without making an enemy of the royal family? Unlikely. What information she had gathered about Prince Oze painted him as a militaristic man with high expectations for his subordinates and a very results-driven mindset. All admirable traits in Tanya's opinion, but ones that sadly worked against her in this instance. He would not be content with Angela trying her hardest and failing, not when much of his daughter's future success could hinge on this first impression to the public. He wanted a clear victory for his daughter. Nothing less. Was it possible to lose without being cast out of the temple by the fire sages? Also unlikely. 100 years of war had left more orphans than the nation could handle, and it was not in the interests of the war effort to publicize information about the struggles these orphans faced. Ignis could kick her out with just a word and nobody would make a fuss. Without their backing, Tanya's already limited opportunities for the future would be greatly diminished. That left but one option. Tanya would have to force a tie between herself and Angela. Not a solution anyone would be happy with, but the sort of concession that could be grudgingly accepted by all parties under the right circumstances. The sages could boast about how, through their enlightened training, Tanya had been able to match a prodigy of royal blood trained by the best tutors money could buy, and Prince Oze could still introduce his daughter as having come first place in her age bracket. Oh, it would still be a sour disappointment to all involved, but wasn't that always the case when people allowed petty grudges to dictate their actions? There was just one problem. Winning was something Tanya could do. Faking a loss was harder, but achievable. But faking a draw? And in such a way that nobody in the audience spotted her deception? That would take some serious precision. What she needed was a strategy. The only way this would work was if she left as little to chance as possible, and that meant she had to use all the time available before her age bracket began to figure out how Angela fought. Chapter 3. It did not take long after the start of the tournament for an opportunity to gather information to present itself. Zuko, Angela's elder brother, was competing in the 7 to 8 year old age bracket, which had been scheduled to take place near the beginning. Though Zuko was 2 years older than Angela, he'd discovered his bending abilities at the age of 6, and as such had been training for roughly the same amount of time as his sister. This presented a perfect opportunity for Tanya to get an estimation of how Angela would fight. After all, if the siblings had been training for the same length of time under the same tutors, then it stood to reason that their styles must share many similarities. From her seat at High Sage Ignis' side, Tanya watched the older children battle it out one by one in the ring below, her eyes firmly fixed on the royal boy whenever he made an appearance. Zuko was, distinctly average, if she was honest. It was clear he'd put a great deal of effort into his training, but he'd simply not trained long enough yet for that effort to start paying off. If he kept that mindset up until his teenage years, he'd probably blossom into a formidable fighter, but his entire age block was dominated by those who were bigger, more talented, or more vicious. As a result, Zuko pushed his way up to about the middle range of the rankings before being knocked out by a bulky boy who hadn't been afraid to dish out a few unsporting hits when the opportunity presented itself. Tanya had at least been able to learn a few things by analyzing his style. Zuko used highly aggressive movements and focused on pressuring opponents with a strong offensive, as most fire-bending styles like to do, but was more focused on speed and precision than raw power like the standard military styles were. His basic movesets involved some rather complex acrobatics for a beginner that Zuko unsurprisingly struggled with, and the wider, sweeping jets of flame that soldiers used in groups to engage multiple enemies at once were replaced with focused, narrow blasts designed to cripple a foe while conserving energy. It was the style of a duelist, one who was expected to fight battles alone rather than side by side with a comrade, and one that Tanya could not help but think didn't quite suit the young royal. Her gut instincts told her that he'd be much more effective with a style suited to teamwork. Still, she'd got the information she'd wanted. It was probable that Angela had been trained in a similar style, and now that she knew some of its common movesets, Tanya could plan moves of her own to counterbalance them. Next she needed information on Angela's mindset, and there was only one place around here that she was going to get that. "Hi Sage, my match will be starting soon. With your permission I'd like to go and meditate somewhere peaceful in preparation." Ignis gave a distracted grunt of approval, eyes never leaving the fights below, and so Tanya hopped off her seat and strode through the spectators' stands, heading in the direction of the contestants' lounge. Wherever she walked people's eyes followed her, and a trail of whispers lingered in her wake. Tanya's body in this world was nearly identical to the one she'd had in her second life, small and delicate looking even for her age, with golden blonde hair that framed her face in messy curls. Black hair seemed to dominate the gene pool in this nation, so her unusual hair color never failed to draw attention. Many would have doubted she was of Fire Nation lineage at all were it not for her eyes. Unlike the blue they'd normally been in her second life, Tanya's eyes in this world were the same yellow gold they'd used to turn when she was invoking magical formulas. This eye color was a rare but distinguished trait unique to the Fire Nation, possessed only by a handful of families other than the royal family themselves. The contestants' lounge was only a short walk away, a simple room of lockers and benches, not unlike the changing rooms at swimming pools. It led directly out into the arena, and was wide and spacious enough for the competing children and their family members to prepare themselves in relative privacy. With the 7 to 8 fights well underway, the only people in the lounge right now were those who'd been eliminated and had yet to leave, including. "Father is going to be angry with me, isn't he?" Prince Zuko was the very picture of a miserable child. Hunched forward, shoulders slumped, and with his hands over his face to cover eyes that were no doubt speckled with tears. By his side a woman with beautiful straight black hair and a golden headdress denoting her as a princess rubbed his back soothingly. "Princess Ursa." Tanya opened a locker close enough to overhear their conversation without arousing suspicion and set about pretending to get ready. "Oh sweetheart," Ursa replied in a consoling tone, "that's not true. Angela wouldn't have lost. And you are not Angela. You're both special in your own ways." "Well, I don't want to be special in my way. I want to be a great firebender too." Zuko's voice pitched up in the beginnings of a tantrum. "Angela isn't afraid. Angela doesn't hesitate. It comes so easily to her. Why am I the only one who struggles?" "Oh Zuko." Ursa wrapped her arms around her son and pulled him into a gentle hug. "Everyone struggles sometimes. We all feel like there's something that's impossible for us. But I promise you that it's just an illusion. With time and dedication you're sure to become a master one day, and you'll be all the greater for having struggled to get there. But do you know what's even more important?" She kissed Zuko lightly on the head. "That you keep your kind heart. That, more than anything, will lead you to a happy life, my son." "But father didn't come here to see a kind heart." That one sentence froze the conversation so awkwardly that even Tanya couldn't help but wince. That was more information that she'd bargained for. It seemed that all was not as well as it appeared within the royal family. Still, courtroom drama aside, Tanya could at least infer useful intel from the conversation. By the sound of it, Angela was quickly developing the right mindset for an efficient warrior, fearless, decisive, and merciless when necessary. No doubt a result of Prince Oze's high expectations. It was a shame Zuko didn't seem to thrive in such an environment like his sister did. After a drawn-out silence, Ursa stood and held her hand out to Zuko. "Come. Let's go back to our seats before Angela's match starts." Zuko shook his head glumly. "You go. I want to stay here for a while." Ursa frowned, but soon accepted it with a soft sigh. "Very well. But come up soon, okay?" "I will." With graceful steps befitting of royalty, Ursa departed, leaving Zuko alone to his sulking. Tanya took a moment to consider her next move. On the one hand, she'd obtained the information she needed, and admitting to eavesdropping would not do her reputation any favors. Yet on the other hand, she had an opportunity here to introduce herself to a member of the royal family. A few words of encouragement here could snag her a connection with a future important figure in high society. And as it so happened, she'd heard quite a few inspirational sounding quotes during her first life. Oh, why not? It wasn't like a few words could do any harm. Chapter 4. Zuko felt ashamed. He could have won that fight. He knew he could have. There had been a moment when his opponent had overreached himself, revealing an opening in his guard that would have allowed Zuko to shoot a blast of fire straight into his chest. The opportunity had been right there in front of him. But he hesitated. It was always that way. Zuko messed up enough as it was during training, but when sparring against an actual opponent he was somehow even worse. He'd been taught again and again to hit every opening your opponent gave you with all your might. Yet the moment he'd spotted his chance, all he could think about was how painful it would be for his opponent to be burned on the chest, and his fist had frozen. Angela wouldn't have hesitated. Father wouldn't have hesitated. Our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Zuko jumped at the sound of a voice nearby, and his head quickly shot around to find the source of it. A few steps away stood a girl smaller and younger than him, with hair like spun gold and yellow eyes as sharp and narrow as a raven hawk's. Whether it was her piercing gaze or the aura of danger cloaking her that caused an uneasy chill ran up his spine, Zuko did not know, but she immediately put his nerves on edge. You have to fight a battle more than once to win it. The strange girl warned like a doomsayer of old. All that matters is that you are the one who wins the war in the end. And no war can be won without blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And then she smiled. Zuko had seen many different kinds of smiles before. He liked to think that the way someone smiled said a lot about who they were. His mother's smile was soft and warm, like the comforting rays of the sun on a summer afternoon. His uncle's smile was wide and hearty, full of adventure and life. His sister's smile was subtle and sly, like a satisfied jackal cat when it caught a bird. But this smile was unlike any he'd ever seen before, and it sent a bolt of cold terror down his spine. It was wide like Uncle's, but strangely lopsided and full of sharp teeth. It was a smile that screamed recklessness, bloodlust, madness. The smile of a demon. With a short bow the terrifying girl strode away, leaving Zuko paralyzed by his fear. He was not the most sociable of children, but Zuko was certain that a smile like that was entirely wrong on a girl as small and young as her. Was she even a girl at all? Or perhaps one of those evil spirits Uncle warned him about? Whatever the case, Zuko was sure that he wanted nothing to do with that girl ever again. Tanya strode toward the arena with her head held high, a triumphant smile on her face. That conversation with Zuko had gone as well as she could have hoped. With a father like Prince Ozai, she'd suspected that using a military analogy would get through to him effectively, but she hadn't expected it to have been so effective as to leave him speechless. No doubt his spirits had been lifted, and in the future he might remember the kind words she'd offered him. Yet now was the time to put thoughts of future politicking to the side, and start focusing on combat. The competition in the 5 to 6 age bracket wasn't as intense as in the older years, but Tanya had to be careful to limit herself to match Angela's abilities during each of her fights to make her final deception seem more plausible. It required strength and discipline in equal measure. Here was hoping a new body and a few years of peace hadn't dulled her battlefield instincts. Something was very unusual about this year's tournament. Prince Iroh would admit that there seemed to be increasingly less he and his brother Ozai saw eye to eye on these days, but one thing they could always find common ground on was their deep appreciation for, and skill at, fire-bending. Which was why, as they watched the 5 to 6 age bracket unfold and Ozai shot him curious glances, Iroh knew he wasn't imagining things. Angela cut through her competition like a hot knife through butter. In each round she demonstrated her overwhelming talent in a different way. During her first round she went for speed, shattering her opponent's defense and taking them down in just under 8 seconds. In her second round she showed off her knowledge of advanced bending moves usually practiced by children 3 or 4 years older than her, and in her third conjured flames almost as big as she was. His niece was out not just to win, but to prove that she was superior to her competitors in every way imaginable. Yet she was not the only outstanding entry. The girl with the golden hair had not seemed like much at first. She was the shortest of the competitors, and held herself with the posture of a military child rather than a noble one. Yet in her first round the golden girl had shattered everyone's expectations by taking down her opponent quickly and efficiently. In just under 8 seconds to be precise. Just like Angela. Once could have been a coincidence, but as the tournament progressed Iroh's doubt continued to grow. When Angela used advanced techniques in her fight, the golden girl used techniques of the same level of skill. When Angela conjured her biggest flames, the golden girl conjured flames of a similar size. Was she copying Angela? No, copying wasn't the right word. The golden girl fought with a variation of the traditional fire-bending style used by the fire sages, though had clearly honed away some of the more frivolous movements in favor of efficiency. Rather than copy Angela's moves, the golden girl used her own moves at exactly the same level as Angela was using. As if she was trying to prove that everything Angela could do, she could do too. But why? What was the point? As far as he knew, Angela had never met this girl before. Was she trying to upstage his niece and steal the publicity from her? Perhaps, but it was incredibly suspicious that their skills would be matched so perfectly evenly. More likely the girl was deliberately holding back her skills and was using Angela as a benchmark. But why? Why fight in the tournament and not aim to win? Iroh glanced over to his brother, whose eyes remained fixed on the golden girl's current fight with the same intensity as he'd watched Angela's. Oze did not allow his feelings to show openly on his face in public, but Iroh had known him long enough to recognize a few telltale signs of what he was thinking, and that slight narrowing of the eyes did not suggest anything good. The next free moment he had, Iroh was going to have to make some inquiries as to who this young girl was. He'd be returning to his campaign through the Earth Kingdom in a few days, but something in his gut told him that today would not be the last time he saw this odd little girl. He just hoped their next meeting wouldn't cause him such concern. Chapter 5. Angela was the best fighter in the world. Okay, maybe not the best in the entire world. Not yet. But she was certainly the best fighter out of everyone her age. She was born to be a master, everybody knew it, and when she grew up she'd be the most powerful bender to have ever lived. Just as father had taught her, she was above all common people. Nobody was her equal. Especially not her. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to our final round. The announcer called, accompanied by polite applause from the audience. To my left is a rising star, a born prodigy, through whom the blood of generations of powerful fire lords flows strong. I give you Angela. Enthusiastic applause broke out across the audience, and Angela allowed herself to preen slightly in their adulation. The strong did not concern themselves with the opinions of the weak, father had taught her that, but there was no harm in accepting praise when it was well deserved. And to my right is the underdog nobody saw coming, who's danced through all her competition thus far like a pixie. I give you Tanya. To Angela's ears, the applause the blonde girl received was just as loud as her own, and a spike of rage jolted through her veins. Today was supposed to be her big day, the day she proved to everyone that she was the rising star of the future. She had made a point in each and every round to demonstrate how superior she was in any and every way possible. Yet this peasant girl, Tanya, seemed to have made it her mission to cast that superiority into doubt. Whatever record Angela set, Tanya was somehow able to perfectly match, as if making a statement that the two of them were equal. Tanya was not her equal. She couldn't be. Nobody could equal her talent and pedigree, especially not some street urchin the fire sages picked up. How the peasant had managed to cheat her way to the finals Angela did not know, but it stopped here. Father had instructed her not to fight too roughly, like they did during their private training sessions, but surely when he gave that instruction he hadn't been expecting this little upstart to act so impudently. Yes, this round she would demonstrate her superior brutality, and crush this peasant so thoroughly that nobody would dare presume themselves to be her equal again. The referee headed out of the ring, leaving the two of them with a few seconds to exchange words before the fight. Tanya bowed at the waist, demonstrating a surprisingly accurate knowledge of courtroom etiquette for a commoner. May the best woman win, Lady Angela. The nerve of her! To imply that it was debatable who the best of the two of them was. Don't worry. I will. Angela shot back, settling into her fighting position. Tanya smiled back briefly and settled into a position of her own. Ready. The referee called. Set. Begin. No sooner had the words left his lips than Angela had pounced into action, firing a sharp bolt of fire directly at Tanya's knee. Cripple her first, steal away her movements, and then hound away at her with power and agility. Just as father had taught her. Yet just as she moved, so too did Tanya. Blonde hair whipped around in a messy hurricane as she pivoted, drawing her knee out of harm's way while similarly building up momentum. From the pivot she spun into a leaping roundhouse kick, sending a slash of fire back in retaliation that Angela had to roll to the side to avoid. Rushing into closer quarters, Angela leapt up and brought a straight punch down towards Tanya's head. Again though Tanya was prepared for it, and raised both arms into a cross guard to block the blow, dispersing the weight of the punch across both arms. As Angela's feet returned to solid ground Tanya struck, twisting one foot out like a snake to wrap around hers, and with a solid push sent her tripping backwards. The sudden feeling of losing balance didn't stop Angela for more than a moment however, and with practiced ease she embraced the change in momentum, falling into a backflip. There was just the briefest second however, at the apex of her backflip, when Angela's eyes had been unable to follow Tanya. As she regained her footing from the flip Angela looked up, only to find that Tanya had not afforded her any chance to recover. She barely caught the first fist Tanya threw her way in time, and was forced onto the defensive as Tanya launched into a flurry of quick, probing strikes designed to ferret out weaknesses in her guard. Still recovering from her unplanned acrobatics, Angela was forced to slowly but surely give away ground as Tanya's barrage pushed her backwards. Rage boiled in Angela's stomach. This was not right. Why was she the one being forced to defend against this dirty peasant? Tanya was smaller than her, younger than her, lesser than her. She was an insect that ought to be squashed under heel. Channel the anger. Make it your strength. Father's teaching flashed through her mind, and with a fierce roar Angela stomped her foot against the ground, putting her anger into an explosive blast of flames. To her own shock, however, the flames that emerged were not her regular red color. They were sharper, hotter, and a rich blue. Tanya seemed just as surprised if the way her eyes widened was any indication, and skipped backwards to put some distance between them while she assessed this new threat. But Angela was quick enough not to let this opportunity slip by. She lunged forward, harnessing her anger again, and with both hands unleashed a straight blast of blue flames. Tanya quickly spun her arms to form a flaming barrier, but when the blue flames collided against it, Angela was satisfied to see Tanya step backwards, a look of concern growing on her face. Yes. She has overpowering her. Most would have surrendered their reason when gripped in the throes of rage, but royalty was above such things. Angela's anger only sharpened her already impressive mind, and rather than maintain her powerful but ultimately stamina-draining attack, she switched tactics. As she cut off her stream of fire, Angela's arms separated, 2 fingers on each hand pointing out like knives, and from each hand a thinner stream of blue flames, about as thick as a ribbon, unfurled. She whipped her arms around in serpentine movements, causing the fire whips to soar outward towards Tanya and strike at her from a multitude of angles, like a nest of snakes hissing and biting at an intruder. Tanya seemed to realize the futility of blocking such an attack, and was forced to begin ducking and weaving through the frenzy of strikes. Dimly Angela could hear the approving roar of the crowd in the background, yet for the first time she found that she didn't care. The vengeful satisfaction of knowing that the tables had turned and that she was now the one forcing Tanya on the defensive was sweeter than freshly picked grapes. This was right. This was how it was meant to be. She had control of the fight now, and the street urchin was dancing to her commands, as was rightfully so. Angela redoubled her vigor, and the speed of the fire whips increased. One struck a glancing blow against Tanya's cheek, leaving a scorch mark. It was only then, with her attention drawn to Tanya's face, that Angela finally noticed the expression the blonde was wearing. She'd been expecting a look of discomfort, perhaps even fear. Instead, what she found was a maniac smile that stretched unnaturally across the little girl's face like a snarling hyena wolf, highlighting wide eyes that seemed to shine with malevolent glee in the light of the blue flames. Tanya flipped backwards to vault over an incoming strike, and Angela smirked as she noticed the odd angle Tanya was falling at. At last the peasant had made a mistake. From that angle she'd never be able to land on her feet, and once she hit the floor Angela would pummel her with a barrage of her strongest attacks. Her whips circled around Tanya's falling form, ready to strike. But then, in a blast of flames, Tanya was moving in mid-air. Technically speaking, the technique for using fire bending for flight was a basic one. All you had to do was unleash your inner fire in a quick, intense burst over a short distance rather than let it roll further away from you, and the thrust generated would propel your own body in the opposite direction of the flames. A number of basic katas used the technique to enhance the momentum of a strong punch or kick, or in brief bursts to change the direction of acrobatic movements mid-air. But to actually use the technique to achieve sustained flight was a different game altogether. Humans were not born to fly, and required many years of practice and experience in order to gain an instinctive grasp of how much thrust and fire was needed to not just defy gravity, but control their flight smoothly. Yet if humans weren't born to fly, whichever spirit watched over Tanya's birth hadn't gotten the memo. With graceful arcs and spins Tanya flitted through the air with the ease of someone who'd been flying for a lifetime, dodging the tendrils of blue fire with so much less effort now that she had a whole new dimension of movement to play with. An odd silence fell over the crowd, and for a moment Angela forgot her rage and found that she shared their sentiment. With her small physique, golden hair, and the nimble ease with which she flew, Tanya did for a moment seem like some otherworldly spirit, like a pixie from a children's fairy tale. Tanya saw her opportunity, and dove forward through a gap in the whips to engage Angela in close quarters once again. As she rocketed down from above she cartwheeled, turning the flames at her feet from short jet bursts into an arrowhead shape, and drop-kicked Angela from above. Tanya was far from heavy, but the full force of gravity behind her shattered through Angela's guard and knocked her a considerable distance backwards. While stumbling to regain her footing, Angela became aware of just how heavily she was breathing, and how damp her forehead had become with sweat. Was she losing? No, that couldn't be possible. Could it? For the first time in her lift, Angela felt an uncomfortable dread trickle down her spine as it dawned on her that she was probably going to be defeated. This dirty little peasant girl, who flew like a pixie and grinned like a demon, was going to beat her before the eyes of the entire nation. Tanya had not pressed her attack when Angela was thrown back, instead opting to reform her own stance and catch her breath as well. She was breathing heavily and sweating as well, betraying the fact that for all her skills she too only had the stamina of a child, yet unlike Angela she didn't look like she'd lost her confidence. In fact, if her feral smile was anything to go by, she'd only become more excited. Neither of them had the stamina to draw this fight out for much longer, so whoever scored the next good hit would be the winner. Angela forced her breathing to steady, quashing down her feelings of unease and focusing on that same rage she'd felt before. As much as she despised Tanya, she was forced to concede that she'd have to give up on her original goal of winning brutally if she wanted to win at all. If they were so closely matched in strength, skill, and agility, then the only thing Angela had left to rely on was cunning. With a flick of her wrist, Angela launched a quick, sharp bolt of blue flames directly at Tanya's face, a move not designed to do damage, but to draw her attention. Unfortunately, it seemed that Tanya had the same idea, firing a similarly sized bolt of red flames at Angela. The two fireballs collided in the air between them, exploding like a firework of blue and red that obscured both of their visions. Angela darted forwards. Tanya wouldn't let this chance slip by either, and would be readying an attack of her own on the other side of the flames. As the sparks began to clear, Angela dropped down and slid on her knees, just in time to avoid the spinning wheel of fire that twirled out at her and passed narrowly above her head. As Tanya finally came into view again, Angela couldn't help but grin at the look of surprise on her face, and whipped her legs out into a sliding kick that knocked Tanya's feet out from under her. Tanya went down, leaving both girls on the floor, and Angela wasted no time seizing her advantage. Like a coiling snake, her legs wrapped around Tanya from behind, and with her arms she caught Tanya's neck in a chokehold. Tanya struggled and bucked, but Angela stubbornly refused to relinquish her grasp. Fire erupted from Tanya's feet again, propelling them across the floor of the arena like a rocket. The blonde girl thrashed around wildly, trying to break the hold, but with a desperate strength she hadn't known she possessed, Angela held on. Just a little longer. Just a few more seconds and she would win. Then father wouldn't be disappointed in her. Slam! The impact whacked into her back like a sledgehammer with such force that Angela's hold crumpled apart. Tanya's jets had never been intended to help her break free of Angela's grip. They'd been to slam them both into the walls around the edge of the arena. Angela struggled to get back to her feet, but the breath had been completely knocked out of her. She'd never felt this exhausted before. Tanya was still on the ground too, arms unsteadily raised to protect her throat. She rolled onto her stomach, bracing herself to stand once more, and a fresh spike of panic shot through Angela's chest. She tried to shoot a ball of fire, but with her breathing disrupted she couldn't summon so much as a flicker. All she could do was watch in horror as Tanya brought one foot forward and began pushing herself up to stand. Only for her knees to buckle. As Tanya's face planted itself into the dirt once more, the referee took that as his cue to run up and stand between them. Both contestants are unable to stand. The match is over, he declared. Quickly he examined them both, then turned back to the audience. The result is a tie. The audience broke out into a cacophony of applause, many even standing and whistling their approval. And who could blame them? That had probably been the most intense fight between 5-year-olds in Fire Nation history. Yet despite the cheers, all Angela cared about was the cold lump of dread settling in her stomach. She hadn't won. And now she had to answer to father. Hey guys, if I get 10 reviews by the next 2 days I'm going to release another 4 chapters. Chapter 6. It wasn't often that Tanya allowed herself to act like the little girl she had the body of, but right now she was just so pleased with herself that she couldn't help but indulge in the desire to skip. It must have been a strange sight for anyone she passed by, a 5-year-old covered in bruises and scorch marks skipping merrily down the halls with a smile on her face. Perhaps that was why everyone hurried to get out of her way when they saw her? Whatever. Tanya couldn't bring herself to care right now. It had been a long time since she'd felt the satisfaction of accomplishing a difficult mission. Angela had been tougher than her brief reconnaissance had suggested. She'd cleverly kept that blue fire trick hidden up her sleeve throughout her previous matches, and had the stubbornness of a wildcat when boxed into a corner. If Tanya hadn't had 2 extra years of practice on her, she might have lost. Fortunately, her last wall-colliding gambit had paid off, and a perfectly feigned wobble of the knee at just the right moment had concluded the match with a perfect draw. High Sage Ignis wasn't happy that she hadn't won, but had been mollified by her demonstration of her mastery of the flight technique. He'd be able to crow on about the benefits of spirituality for years to come and, more importantly, Tanya hadn't painted a large target for the royal family on her back. In fact, she might go so far as to say that she and Angela had connected during their little bout. Maybe she was imagining things, but felt like there was a spirit of friendly competition between them. An excellent display, little lady. You have quite the talent. Tanya looked to the side, where a young man with impressive sideburns and a face that made her think of a monkey was slowly clapping his hands. He wore the armor of the Fire Nation Navy, and to have gained access to an event like this Tanya knew he must have achieved at least an officer rank. The man walked forward and offered a hand, which Tanya shook without hesitation, noting his weathered and fiercely tanned skin. She'd shaken hands like this before during her second life when meeting soldiers fresh out serving in desert campaigns. Now why would a member of the Navy have been serving in the desert? Perhaps he'd been in the army, and the experience had given him such an appreciation for water that he'd transferred straight after. Junior Lieutenant Zhao. The man introduced himself with a charming smile. Or wait, I suppose it's just Lieutenant Zhao now. Sorry, I'm still getting used to the idea of holding a serious rank. A rising star in the military? How interesting. Zhao didn't speak like a man of noble birth, and to have achieved the rank of lieutenant at his age suggested that he must have made quite the meritorious achievement. Tanya. She replied courteously, offering a respectful nod. And thank you. I've been studying hard in the hopes of becoming a master. She may not have wanted to be discovered as a firebender at first, but once the secret was out and her future conscription all but guaranteed, it was only logical to become as skilled as she could. Mastery of firebending could very well mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield. Zhao's smile grew. So I see. You studied under the fire sages, correct? It's rare to see a traditional style like theirs these days, but you certainly made good use of it. Unlike the royal style, which was better suited to dueling, or the military style, which emphasized simple movements that could be used in conjunction alongside other soldiers, the fire sages' style was more ceremonial. Its forms were designed for more precise shaping and control of flames rather than speed or power, better for putting on a show rather than inflicting damage. After nearly 100 years of war, the style had fallen out of use among the public, but with some experimentation Tanya had found a way to cut some of the more superfluous moves, and adapt others into more useful techniques for a war zone. Her variations of the traditional flight technique was just one such example. Modesty was the better part of valor though, and nobody liked to hear a braggart. Tanya smiled gratefully. Thank you, sir. I had good teachers. Regardless, you must be a quick study. Zhao continued. Tell me, have you given much thought to which branch of the military you intend to join when you're older? I don't know. Is there a branch filled with cushy office jobs far behind enemy lines? Zhao laughed heartily, doubtlessly having assumed she was joking. Ha! Not a fan of marching, are you? Well, why not consider joining the Navy? It's a damn sight easier living on a ship than it is walking across the Earth Kingdom on foot. That was actually a very good idea. Of the other nations, the air nomads had already been wiped out, and the southern water tribes pillaged to the point that they no longer presented a serious threat bar a couple of primitive raiding ships. The main competitors left in this war were the Earth Kingdom, whose presence at sea was nearly non-existent, and the Northern Water Tribe, who remained staunchly secure in their fortress at the North Pole and only acted to directly defend themselves. The Fire Nation ruled the sea these days, and the Navy's main job was to escort supply ships and raid port towns. It wasn't risk-free by any stretch of the imagination, but it would definitely be safer than the meat grinder that was the front lines. In an ideal world, Tanya would have avoided military service altogether, or at the very least taken a posting in a logistics-based job that kept her as far away from the people who could throw boulders with their minds as possible. Sadly, firebenders were just too useful of an asset to not be used as much as possible. In order to get a safe posting, Tanya's only option was to climb to a rank high enough that she'd have to remain away from the front lines in order to issue strategic commands. If her knowledge of the Navy's hierarchy was correct, she'd need to obtain the rank of admiral in order to be able to duck out of any form of direct combat, and the handful of admirals in the Fire Lord's War Council were all older men with many years of experience under their belts. Just below an admiral, however, came the ranks of captains, commanders who could stay safely within the decks of their huge metal ships and deploy their crew to do the most dangerous work for them. That was probably as close to an administrative job as Tanya could reasonably hope to get in the next decade or so before the war was finally won. Suppose that I was interested, Tanya began, how would I go about securing my place? I wasn't aware that conscripts were offered a choice of where to serve. Zhao's grin grew wider. It's just a matter of knowing the right people. Perhaps we should stay in touch? It's important that talent gets the recognition it deserves, don't you think? I'd be happy to have a position under my command reserved for you when you're old enough for service. What a nice fellow. Tanya found she didn't need to force the smile that came across her face as she nodded respectfully. That would be most kind. Thank you, Lieutenant. Zhao chuckled. Think nothing of it. I always keep an eye out for the fire-bending masters of the future. Chapter 7. Oze wasn't usually disappointed by his daughter. Angela kneeled a few feet away from where he sat, nervously waiting for him to say something. After her performance today, she deserved to stew in his displeasure for a while. That she had awakened the rare blue flames had been a stroke of good fortune, enough to salvage her reputation after that disaster of a fight, but it did not absolve her of her failure. Angela took to the lessons he gave her like a natural, whether they be on combat, politics, or morality. There had been a few mistakes in the past, usually after her mother had filled her head with some sentimental nonsense, but it never took long to correct her mistakes. He could usually count on Angela to act in a way befitting of his heir. Yet today Oze found himself disappointed. No, that wasn't a strong enough word. It was more accurate to say that he was infuriated. He had never imagined that Angela might lose to anyone of her own age, but now he saw that he'd been too lax in her training. Oh, the rabble might think that she and that commoner child had been equally matched, but Oze was not fooled. The blonde girl had planned for the match to end in a tie right from the beginning, and Angela had allowed herself to be led by the nose. Speaking of the blonde girl, Tanya, Oze was torn on how to deal with her. That she represented the Fire Sages irked him. People forgot, but the original Fire Lord had been a member of the Fire Sages, and had ruled with them as his equals. Time had separated the Fire Lord into a more political entity, but the Fire Sages still held the exclusive right to coronate the new Fire Lord, or to refuse to do so if they disapproved of them. The idea that those old fossils of a bygone era should have any power over the Fire Lord, however fleeting, was an insult. The weak should never dictate the will of the strong. Once he became Fire Lord and brought an end to this war, he would establish a new regime where the authority of he and his chosen heirs was beyond any doubt. Yet as much as he despised the Fire Sages, he did not see this Tanya as one of them. The girl had shown more than just fire-bending talent during her fights, but also cunning, ferocity and ambition. All traits he prized. That monstrous grin the girl wore as she fought was exactly the kind of expression he'd been trying to instill into his own daughter. He could not leave such an asset in the hands of the sages, but eliminating her would be such a waste. Angela shifted uncomfortably, drawing his attention back to her. That should be long enough. With slow, deliberate words Oze spoke. You failed me. Angela's face blanched, her fists tightening so hard that her knuckles turned white. Good. At least she understood the consequences of failure. It was her fault. Angela stuttered. She must have cheated somehow. She is not my equal. Words are empty, Angela. Results are everything. Angela held her tongue, but her expression betrayed her indignation. Interesting. It seemed his daughter had taken the commoner girl's challenge personally. Could that be the reason why Angela had unlocked her blue flames in the middle of a fight of all times? Had her desire to defeat Tanya provided the motivation she needed to surpass her previous limits? And just like that, a plan formed in Oze's mind. A solution that would kill all his birds with one stone. I shall be sending a letter to the High Temple, he declared. An invitation for Tanya to attend the Royal Fire Academy for girls under a scholarship from the royal family. It would be a waste to allow talent to untapped after all. Though I fear a peasant child may not feel comfortable among the children of nobility. I expect you to help her feel welcome. Take her amongst your friends. Angela's eyes widened in horror. But father. Am I clear, Angela? Angela bit her lip, visibly shaking with emotion, and for a moment Oze suspected she might speak out in defiance. Yet the moment passed, and Angela's shoulders slumped as she accepted her punishment. Yes, father. Good. You may go. Angela stood, bowed, and hurriedly left, no doubt to find something to burn. Out of all the lessons he'd taught her, one she'd taken especially well to was his philosophy on friendship. Genuine friendship was a parasite for the strong, a leech that bound you to the weak and compelled you to waste your time and effort on solving their pitiful problems. Yet through the guise of friendship one could forge an effective leash to keep useful pawns under your thrall. Angela had done well in selecting her friends so far, choosing two girls of similar age with noble lineages and useful connections, who both possessed useful skills that Angela could learn for herself or deploy for her own purposes. However, her decision to not befriend a child with the ability to firebend was telling. She did not suffer anybody who might be able to rival her. Oze had learnt many important life lessons indirectly from Iroh. His struggles to prove that he was just as good, if not better, than his oh-so-sanctimonious brother had taught him much about the drive hatred could grant you when used properly. Having a mortal enemy inspired you to put your utmost effort into destroying them. Yet the one who should have been that rival for Angela, Zuko, was a soft-hearted weakling who'd give up and run to his mother rather than provide any sort of challenge. In a way, Angela's success had been her failing. She had never learned how to deal with competition, for there was nobody who could compete with her. Until now. Enrolling Tanya at a royal academy would separate her from the fire sages for most of the time before she could be conscripted into military service, and would drive a wedge in the sages' plans to use her as their poster child. Forcing Angela to accept the peasant into her social circle would also teach his daughter how to cope with a genuine rival, while simultaneously giving his daughter time to work her hooks into this girl and make her a puppet. With her natural talent and a fine education, Tanya was certain to become a powerful weapon for the Fire Nation, one that would dance to his daughter's tune, and by extension his too. Yes, destiny seemed to have greatness in store for young Tanya. Greatness that, through his designs, would be harvested in service to the Fire Nation. Chapter 8. Ty Lee loved her friends. Angela was always so brave, and talented in everything she did. She could count on Alyasa to always be strong for the both of them, and to know what to do no matter the situation. Okay, sure, Angela could be a little rough sometimes, and could sometimes say things to her that made the corners of her eyes prickle with the beginnings of tears, but Ty Lee knew that it was just one of the ways Angela was looking out for her. Like that time she had confided in her friends about her secret dream of running away to join the circus, and Angela had laughed and began nicknaming her circus freak. Ty Lee had cried into her pillow when she got home, but come the next day she understood that Angela had actually been helping her. If she'd told her sisters or parents about her dream, she'd have received a much harsher punishment, and if it had gotten around the school, her classmates would have taunted her about it forever. Angela had been teaching her an important lesson, that silly little fantasies belonged locked up in her head, and should never be told to anybody. Mai was a little shy, but was loyal to a fault and had amazing aim. Her reserved nature balanced out with Ty Lee's usual bubbliness perfectly, and she was always willing to step in and help when people asked things of her that she felt too polite to refuse. Sometimes Ty Lee liked to hang out alone with Mai and relax after Angela led them off on a fun, but sometimes stressful, adventure. Not that they told Angela about these days, of course, they didn't want her to feel left out. Then there was Tanya. Ty Lee was a little surprised when Angela had immediately taken a student with a commoner background under her wing, but she'd wholeheartedly approved. Tanya had such beautiful golden hair, and her serious attitude was adorable coming from someone so small and cute looking. The fierce pout that would cross her face every time someone mentioned how darling she looked in her uniform made Ty Lee want to squeal with glee. The fact that she was a genius who consistently scored perfect marks in every test they did, no matter what lesson, and was always happy to help her out with homework was icing on the cake. But if she was being honest, Tanya scared her sometimes. She felt horrible for even thinking it, like she was some kind of traitor, but she couldn't help her thoughts. And she didn't mean fear in that uncomfortable sense she sometimes got when she couldn't do something Angela had asked her to do. No, she meant a fierce shiver that would run down her back and tell her to run away as fast as she could. The first time it happened was during their first lesson on military strategy since Tanya enrolled. As General Iroh's siege of Ba Sing Se was the talk of the nation at the time, their teacher had posed a hypothetical scenario to the class about how they would go about breaching the legendary walls. Most of the class had offered uninspired answers: siege towers, underground tunnels, or even firing soldiers over the wall via catapults. But when it was Tanya's turn, the little blonde girl had launched into a 20-minute pitch on not just how to breach the walls, but also claim and hold the entire outer section of the city. She advocated sending raiding parties out across the surrounding lands to burn every village in the province to the ground, notably not killing anyone, but giving the survivors the barest amount of supplies necessary for them to make the journey to Ba Sing Se. By flooding the city with refugees, she reasoned, Ba Sing Se's government would be incapable of properly handling the logistics needed to provide them all with food and shelter, leading to a growing sense of discontentment as the city clogged up with people and more refugees turned to crime in order to survive. If an uprising didn't naturally occur within the 6 weeks, spies could be snuck in amongst the refugees with orders to burn the food stores. Once the uprising began, many soldiers posted on the outer walls would have to be pulled back to help deal with it, leaving the wall undermanned for a mass incursion via siege ladders. It was not the tactical genius that scared Tai Li. It was the dispassionate, almost uncaring, way that Tanya spoke about both civilians and soldiers, how she referred to them as human resources rather than actual people. It was the glint in her eye when she talked about the efficiency of launching the assault in the middle of the uprising, massacring the guards when they were at their weakest. It was the ring of certainty in her voice when she finished delivering her pitch, as if she'd already tried a strategy like this before, and personally knew that it would be effective. In lessons of history, etiquette, economics, or anything else not applicable to war, Tanya was a model pupil, diligent, hardworking, and always successful. To be fair, she was all of those things during lessons related to warfare too, but it was at those times that she seemed to really come alive in the worst sense of the word, grinning like a lion before cornered prey, and spouting out cruel diatribe about the other nations or advising ruthless, merciless strategies to attain victory. Tai Li was not at all surprised when she found out that Tanya was in regular contact with a Navy lieutenant who'd all but guaranteed her a position in his command. For all that Tanya liked to claim that she thought war was a senseless waste of resources, none of her classmates believed her, even though they were too afraid to say it to her face. Tanya was a natural-born soldier. A natural-born killer. Yes, Tai Li loved her friends. But when she closed her eyes and dreamed of running away to join the circus, she never envisioned her friends coming with her. Peace and relaxation. Was there anything more beautiful? Tanya had been surprised to receive an invitation to study at the Royal Fire Academy for girls. It was the top school in the nation, exclusively for the children of nobility, and not a place she would have had any chance of getting into were it not for the scholarship from the royal family. It was a rare opportunity that suited her goals perfectly, for the academy worked in partnership with the army to offer officer training to its students. Graduating would allow her to enter the Navy at the rank of junior lieutenant, immediately giving her some level of authority and skipping the positions that were likely to put her directly in harm's way. It was only 2 ranks away from a captain, and 4 ranks away from her ultimate goal of becoming an admiral. The reason for such a stroke of good fortune revealed itself on her first day, when Angela had approached her at the first opportunity and introduced Tanya to her friends. It would seem that Tanya really hadn't imagined that spark of friendship between them during her match. Poor Jose. No doubt he'd patiently endured Angela's pestering for as long as he could before finally giving in to her demands, and pulled a few strings to have a place offered to Tanya. An act of such soft parenting would no doubt have the more traditional nobility tutting with disapproval. Being friends with royalty certainly had its advantages though, and not just at opening new doors for her career. Tanya had been expecting that, in a school full of noble children, a commoner girl like her would be a ripe target for bullying. Instead, most of the other students parted like the Red Sea wherever she walked, and treated her with unfaltering politeness, some even shaking at the knees whenever she stepped too close. Being best friends with royalty seemed to make her untouchable. Tanya aced all of her lessons, scoring perfect marks on every test or challenge they presented to her. The honor of being top student used to be Angela's alone, but when Tanya arrived, Angela had started studying harder than ever to match her, and once again Tanya felt pleased at the spark of friendly competition they shared. Yet if she was being honest, Tanya was a little bored by most of her lessons. Subjects like history and etiquette were interesting, but the simple fact was that Tanya had already been to school before, and in time periods that had been considerably more advanced than this one. She knew of concepts that her teachers couldn't even dream of, and having to sit through lessons that she already knew quickly became tedious. It was selfish and entirely ungrateful to dismiss her peaceful education as boring when soldiers fighting on the battlefield would have given a limb to be where she was, but such was the curse of perspective. In a few years' time, when she was forced into the war, she'd look back on these boring lessons with a fond smile. More interesting was the time that Tanya got to spend with Angela and her other 2 friends, Tai Li and Mai. Both were kind and friendly girls, and were always so eager to support Angela in whatever she said or did. That was true friendship right there. Sometimes Zuko would join in too, but most of the time he would avoid them whenever Tanya was around. Zuko acted very awkward in Tanya's presence, stuttering over his words, and looking away whenever she made eye contact. It wasn't long before Tanya came to an uncomfortable realization about why this was. Zuko had a crush on her. It was the only condition that matched all the symptoms he was displaying. Her inspiring words back at the tournament must have done too good a job at lifting his spirits, and now his feelings for her were leaving him confused whenever she was around. It was a disaster in so many ways. For one thing, although she now wore the body of a young girl, at heart Tanya was a middle-aged man. Having someone so young crushing on him, however unrequited, was an uncomfortable experience. For a second Thing Mai seemed to have a bit of a crush on Zuko herself if she wasn't mistaken, and Tanya had no intention of getting involved in some kind of period drama love triangle rom-com. And for a third thing, Zuko just wasn't her type. Unfortunately, Tanya didn't know how to go about letting him down gently without breaking his little heart, and so did her best to act with respectful, albeit a little cold, formality when talking with him to avoid getting his hopes up. There were some days when Angela invited her over to play privately, and the two of them usually spent their time sparring and practicing firebending together. Considering that she was Angela's only firebender friend, not to mention the only one who could beat her, Tanya didn't mind these bouts at all. She even let Angela beat her every now and again, just to make sure she didn't get disheartened. Coincidentally, on these days Prince Ozai would sometimes make an appearance, and had even invited her to stay for dinner a couple of times. Tanya liked Ozai. He was a firm, commanding man who put a staggering amount of effort into his work, but always found time for his daughter's education. Unlike his warmongering brother, General Iroh, Ozai preferred to dedicate his time to the arts of politics and statecraft, a far more worthy profession in Tanya's opinion. At the same time, though, it was clear that he wasn't afraid to wage war or even step into combat himself when the situation demanded it, and firmly believed in the Fire Nation's aim of bringing order and prosperity to a soon-to-be unified world. During their meals, Prince Ozai would quiz them about the state of the war, the history of the Fire Nation, and a range of other patriotic subjects, as well as offer his own logical and well-reasoned opinions on strategy, philosophy, and economics that Tanya often found herself agreeing with. His wording could be a little extreme at times, but the core of his beliefs was that rewards should only be given to those with the dedication, talent, or power to earn them. A true capitalist. Chapter 9. During their meals, Prince Ozai would quiz them about the state of the war, the history of the Fire Nation, and a range of other patriotic subjects, as well as offer his own logical and well-reasoned opinions on strategy, philosophy, and economics that Tanya often found herself agreeing with. His wording could be a little extreme at times, but the core of his beliefs was that rewards should only be given to those with the dedication, talent, or power to earn them. A true capitalist. The coming years were not kind to Angela or her father. There was one year when they received news that Lu-10, the son of Prince Iroh, had died in battle, and that the siege of Ba Sing Se had been lifted. As if that wasn't bad enough, Fire Lord Ajalan passed away soon after, wisely proclaiming Ozai to be his successor on his deathbed, and mere days later Princess Ursa's life was claimed by a sudden illness. This string of tragedy in such short succession would have been enough to sour anyone's coronation, but both Ozai and Angela, dignified royalty to the end, bore their grief with stoicism, never allowing it to show on their faces so as not to worry their subjects. Tanya was reassured to know that Ozai was the sort of ruler who could remain strong in the face of tragedy, even if she did think it might be healthier for Angela to open up a bit more. By contrast, Tanya positively flourished during her school years. Knowing most of the subject content just gave her more time to practice her firebending. And she was unashamed to boast that she was bloody good at it. Her flight technique had been honed to such a level that she could comfortably pull off moves she'd learned in her second life, and whether on the ground or in the sky she could annihilate pretty much anyone below master level in a fight. When her time to serve in the military finally came, Tanya was confident that she had done all she could to ensure her best chance at surviving. Which was why, on the day of her 13th birthday, Tanya found herself standing in front of a full-length mirror, staring at the reflection of herself dressed in the black and red armor of the Navy. It was embarrassing that she remained so damn short they'd had to commission a special set of miniature armor just for her, but she held out hope that she'd hit a growth spurt as her teenage years progressed. At least whoever made this armor for her had accepted her request to include a black and red peaked cap rather than the traditional metal helmet. Tanya had been awfully fond of this style of cap in her second life, and thought that the golden flame insignia printed on the front matched her hair rather nicely. "Tanny! Don't go!" Ty Lee sobbed melodramatically, somehow managing to wrap Tanya in a hug without impaling herself on the spiked epaulets of her uniform. "Make sure you write as often as you can, okay? In fact, write every day. Yes, and do try not to get knocked overboard and drown," Angela said coolly, lounging across a nearby sofa. "After all the money father invested in you, it'd be such a waste if you went and died too quickly." Tanya chuckled at Angela's particular brand of dark humor. "I'll be fine. It'll just be a few years at sea, maybe the odd raid or two, and I'll make admiral before you know it. Then I'll be back here again to draw up strategic plans with the War Council, and we'll all be together again." Mai huffed from where she stood against the wall. "I hope so." Dad's been lobbying to be appointed the governor of a city out in the colonies. Why in the world Maya's dad would want to leave the safety of the homeland to rule over some dusty, rebel-filled city close to a war zone, Tanya did not understand. But then again Yukino never had been the most intelligent of men. Let's hope that doesn't happen. At least Tai will still be here to keep you company, Angela. Maybe she was seeing things, but Tai Li's smile seemed just a little bit tighter for a second. That's right. She replied cheerfully. So you better make sure you come home too. Home, hey? She didn't really consider the High Temple her home, but in a broader sense she did feel the love one felt for their homeland here in the Fire Nation. She had people here that she loved and respected, and the thought of stepping foot off her native soil brought with it an unexpected sense of melancholy. Yes, the Fire Nation was a country she was surprised to find she was a little proud to represent, even if she did think the war it was waging against the rest of the world was a waste of resources. A knock at the door signaled it was time to go, and after one last hug to each of her friends, Tanya opened it and followed the soldier waiting outside. They led her out of the royal palace and through the maze-like streets of capital city, until at last they reached the port. Waiting in one of the wharves was a hulking mass of black metal, expertly shaped into a sleek and seaworthy design by the progress of Fire Nation engineering. Ajalan's Revenge it was named, and waiting at the top of the gangplank, resplendent in his armor and flanked on either side by 2 elite troops, was a man that Tanya could not help but smile to see. But now was the time for formality, and so as she reached the top of the gangplank Tanya struck a perfect salute, only allowing the slight curling at the corners of her mouth to convey her happiness. Captain Zhao. She greeted him respectfully. Junior Lieutenant Tanya reporting for duty. At ease, Lieutenant. Zhao replied, giving a short salute and a smile of his own. It really had been good of him to keep his word and have a place on his ship reserved for her after all this time. Keeping in contact with him had definitely paid off. What is our first assignment, sir? Tanya asked dutifully. Zhao chuckled. Eager for combat? Well, you're in luck. Scouts have reported an Earth Kingdom military vessel trespassing in our waters. Orders are to intercept and destroy them with maximum prejudice. A wicked grin crossed his face. I think it's the perfect opportunity to show me some of those techniques you've told me so much about. Tanya couldn't hold back the grin of her own. As you command, sir. Postings at sea were the worst. Anson stifled a yawn into his hand, keeping his bleary eyes fixed on the vast expanse of ocean ahead. He missed the feeling of good, solid rock and soil beneath his feet. Earthbenders weren't meant to live atop this water nonsense. Still, orders were orders, and everyone had to do their part if they wanted any hope of repelling the Fire Nation from their shores. The idea that his hard work, however boring it could be sometimes, could save his daughter from growing up in a country owned by firebenders was all the motivation he needed to keep going. He broke from his musings as a dark shape appeared on the far horizon. Quickly unfurling his spyglass, Anson's pulse began to quicken at what he saw. Fire National Ship. Port side. He shouted, and soon heard the alarm bells ringing and troops scurrying around into battle positions behind him. Just one ship? Good, it would be a fair fight then, and everyone knew that the Fire Nation never won in a fair fight. He kept his telescope fixed on the approaching threat as the captain came to stand beside him. Report. The captain commanded. One ship on the east horizon. Seems to be a cruiser. In range of our trebuchets. Not yet, but it's approaching fast. Wait, no, it's coming to a stop. Something wasn't right about this. The Fire Nation prized aggression in all things, and normally wouldn't hesitate to attack unless outnumbered. Why then had they stopped so far away when their weapons couldn't hope to reach them from there? A flicker of bright orange light against the dull darkness of the iron ship caught his attention, and Anson immediately tracked it through his spyglass. Sir, they've deployed something from the deck. It's rising rapidly. The captain frowned. Some kind of weapon? I don't think so, sir. It looks more like a child. Yes, it was a child. A little girl, no older than 10 judging by the size of her, with unusual golden hair and a military uniform. He'd heard stories about firebenders who could fly, but never so high or so fast. This one looked like she could challenge the airbenders of old. Give me that. The captain muttered, grabbing the spyglass and fixing it on the strange flicker of light heading up into the sky. His frown hardened as he confirmed what Anson saw. What on earth are they playing at, sending a kid into a war zone? Some kind of reconnaissance? I don't think so. She's too high up for that. They watched in uneasy silence as the little girl flew ever higher, coming to a stop directly above the ship. From so high up her hair and flames were mere pinpricks, as if one of the distant stars in the night sky had decided to hang around into the day. Suddenly that distant pinprick split into 2, then 3, the 4. All of a sudden they were rapidly multiplying, and Anson didn't need to be a genius to figure out what was going on. She's firing at us. Defensive positions. Protect our trebuchets. The captain roared, and all across the deck soldiers raised shields of rocks and stone from strategically positioned pits to protect them from the rain of fire. Rain was an accurate statement, for each fireball was no bigger than a drop of rain, and would really do no more damage than a painful scorch mark on its own. They would have been nothing but a minor irritation if not for the sheer quantity with which they fell. Are the trebuchets unharmed? Bellowed the captain. Looking around the deck, Anson could see that all of the siege engines remained unscathed. If the girl's intention had been to quickly remove those from the battle, then she was naive for thinking it would be so easy. Sir! The Fire Nation ship. Chapter 10. Are the trebuchets unharmed? Bellowed the captain. Looking around the deck, Anson could see that all of the siege engines remained unscathed. If the girl's intention had been to quickly remove those from the battle, then she was naive for thinking it would be so easy. Sir! The Fire Nation ship. Anson looked back to the ocean, and indeed the Fire Nation cruiser was once again plowing a path towards them. He could see soldiers in red armor scurrying around the black decks, readying trebuchets of their own. Damn it! Even if their heavy weaponry was unharmed, they couldn't load and fire it while the flaming rain was falling. They were pinned down. How long is that brat going to keep this hellfire up? Not much longer if I have anything to say about it. The captain roared. Shoot her down. At his command, earthbenders across the ship punched forwards, sending rocks rocketing up into the air. Yet gravity was not on their side, and bled momentum from the projectiles the higher they climbed. Before long the rocks came tumbling back to the ocean, having failed miserably to reach the demon star above. Captain! The cruiser is in firing distance. All eyes turned back to the ocean, where a volley of barrels were being launched from the Fire Nation ship. Within seconds they collided against the deck, spreading wide puddles of black oil that soon caught alight from a drop of hellfire and burst into flames. Within moments a good quarter of the deck was awash with fire. Yet the nightmare wasn't over yet. Already Anson could see huge round balls of coal being loaded into the trebuchets. Sir! They're going to bombard us! The captain's eyes were wide with the beginnings of panic now, but through force of will he kept his voice steady. All hands brace for impact. Soldiers scurried left and right, grabbing hold of the nearest railing they could find as the coal balls were lit and fired into the air. Each one caused the ship to rattle and screech as they hit, spreading yet more flames across the deck. Yet those weren't the only sounds. In between the heavy cracks Anson also heard metallic twangs and sharp, thudding impacts. Large harpoons fired from ballistae had sunk into their side, and the heavy chains attached to them now dragged the two ships together. They're going to board us! Anson yelled. The captain looked around, glaring hatefully at the damage done to his vessel, before firming his expression with grim resolve. If that's how they want to play it, then fine, let them come. We'll repel their first wave and then push back, counterboarding their ship while they're licking their wounds. Form up, men! Prepare for an assault! Although still reeling from the brief bombardment, Earth soldiers were nothing if not stubborn, and at the sound of their captain's voice pushed themselves forward on unsteady feet to rally at his side. Great swathes of rock and grit rolled forward like a wave, quenching many of the pools of flame as they formed into a barrier across the port side of the deck, a wall of stone that the fury of the firebenders would crash uselessly upon. Yet something felt wrong. The air was too clear. Anson looked up, barely realizing that the rain of hellfire had ceased in time to see the demon child rapidly falling from above. Just as it seemed assured that she would crash into the waves, the girl pulled up, rocketing across the water at such speed that she seemed like a blur of black and gold to his eyes. As she whizzed across the starboard side, a sharp ribbon of flame lashed out at the soldiers' turned backs, causing many to cry out in pain. With perfect timing, a battle cry resounded out from the Fire Nation cruiser as the first wave of red-clad soldiers jumped aboard, releasing fierce jets of flame at the earthen barricade. Most sections of the wall held steady, but the earthbenders who'd been most badly hurt by the blonde girl's flaming whip could not help but falter under the sudden pressure. Their sections of the barricade broke apart, letting waves of flame roll into the earthbenders' ranks. Chaos descended as the fire soldiers pushed forward, breaking the earth soldiers apart into smaller groups and dissolving the fighting into a frenzied melee. The earth soldiers struggled back, but too many disadvantages had been stacked up against them. With some pools of flame still scattered about the deck, the fire soldiers had the option to attack from many angles rather than just the front, and there wasn't enough earth on the ship for the earth soldiers to defend themselves from so many angles quickly enough. One by one the patches of resistance faltered and faded before the unrelenting tide of fire. Anson found himself alongside a ragtag group of remaining soldiers, one of the last holdouts of resistance aboard the deck. Bolt after bolt of fire came flying their way, each one breaking against stone in just the nick of time. The captain was nowhere in sight, lost somewhere in the onslaught, and with each passing second more and more firebenders converged on his position. A dreadful certainty settled in his gut, and Anson knew that all hope of victory was lost. "I'd say it's about time to surrender now, don't you think?" A voice, childishly high-pitched yet twinged with a chilling glee, sounded behind him, and Anson came face to face with the blonde child as she touched down daintily upon the railing. In the light of the fires her yellow eyes shone like hot coals, burning with hateful glee as she observed the destruction. How could anyone smile the way she did in the face of all this death? Surely no child, no human born with even an ounce of love in their heart, could revel in this man-made hell? The answer dawned on him with terrible certainty. This was no child. It must be one of those vengeful demon spirits in human form, here to dance in the misery and terror spread by the Fire Nation's conquest. He couldn't let this embodiment of evil reach his homeland. Couldn't let its path of ruin and destruction reach his wife and daughter in Ba Sing Se. If this was to be his final hour, then let his last act be to take this monster down to the darkest pits of the spirit world with him. "Monster!" he roared, pivoting on one heel and bringing a hammer of rock sweeping towards her head with all his fury. Yet the demon sped forward, slipping down and beneath his arm before it could connect. Bam! Anson felt an impact hit his chest with an unfamiliar echo, as if hearing it from very far away. All at once darkness seemed to be creeping into the edges of his vision, and the sounds of the battle around him became muted and fuzzy. Slowly he looked down, staring uncomprehendingly at the hand of a little girl touching his chest, smoking fingertips gently stroking the edges of the large hole she had just burnt through his chest. Strange. He had always expected death by fire to feel like a burning agony. Instead he just felt cold and hollow, as if the soul had been ripped right out of him. "You should have given up while you had the chance." The girl, the monster, whispered in his ear, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "But I'm glad you didn't." She grabbed him by the shoulder, and the next thing Anson knew the world had flipped over itself as he threw him overboard. The last thing he saw was her turning her back on him, not even deigning to pay attention to his final moments, before the waves claimed him. Chapter 11. Captain Zhao flattered himself that he was not usually one to brag. But there were times where one deserved to boast, and this was definitely one such time. He was a man touched by destiny. He'd known it ever since the day he'd found Wan Shi Tong's library, and the scroll that revealed the identity of the moon and ocean spirits within. He would someday obtain glory everlasting as Zhao the Moon Slayer, the one who rid the world of the scourge of waterbending forever. The only thing that stood between him and his destiny was power. Only an admiral had the authority to lead an invasion against the northern water tribes on the scale that he needed, and as a captain he was still 2 ranks away from that lofty position. He had lied, betrayed and cheated to get this high up the ranks, but now it seemed that destiny had delivered the tool he needed to climb those final steps right into his lap. He'd known Tanya would be something special ever since the day he saw her compete against Princess Azula. It had been a stroke of pure good fortune that he'd been the first one to meet her after she first demonstrated her fire-bending talents, and that he'd been able to sway her into his command so easily, yet even back then he hadn't fully realized just what a prodigy she would turn out to be. Not only was she a real fire-bending master at the age of 13, but one blessed with an incredible gift for flight, a tactical genius as efficient as it was cruel, and a close connection to the Fire Lord's daughter. Fire Lord Oze himself had sent private messages to him inquiring about Tanya's progress, making it clear that she was someone he had singled out from the common rabble as someone of great importance to the future of the Fire Nation. And now that same rising star was bound to him. He was sure to be promoted to commander for the overwhelmingly successful capture of this Earth Nation vessel, and had Tanya to thank for it. He would continue to keep the girl close by his side, sharing her successes and promoting her in lockstep with his own ascension through the ranks. Some of his men were already calling her the Fairy of the Fire Nation because of her dainty appearance, and Zhao couldn't help but think the description was apt. On the wings of this fairy he would soar towards the bright destiny that awaited him. Yes, he was without doubt the one chosen by destiny. Down, down Anson sank into the depths, unable to muster enough strength to so much as twitch his fingers, or close his lips against the bubbles of air that escaped his lungs. It was so cold, so dark, and yet with each passing second distantly comfortable, like falling asleep. In his last moments Anson's thoughts turned to the family he was leaving behind at home, unprepared for the nightmare that was heading their way from across the sea, and his heart was gripped by fear and regret. Without thinking his lips began to move, chanting a silent prayer. "O spirits, I pray to you for a better future for my daughter." And as the darkness claimed him, Anson heard a voice, deep and ancient, ring out to him from the depths. Like an étoile in ballet, or a prima donna in opera, she will have an unbreakable will and a glittering destiny. For I have heard you, and by my will it shall be done. Far across the sea, behind the great walls of Ba Sing Se, a beautiful woman dressed in the green of the Earth Kingdom gasped, suddenly stricken by a deep sadness. She did not know how she knew, but something in her heart told her that the worst had indeed come to pass. Her beloved husband was gone. He would never return home to hold her and their darling daughter together in his arms. Without thinking her hands came together, and her thoughts coalesced into a whispered prayer on her lips. "O spirits, I pray to you to protect my daughter. All I want is for her, the most precious thing my husband left behind in this world, to be protected." And in that moment she could swear that a voice, deep and ancient, whispered down to her from the sky. "Swords will break before her, arrows will dodge her, fire will not reach her, and her wounds will heal. For I have heard you, and by my will it shall be done." Upon the walls of Ba Sing Se a young girl stood, staring out at the horizon before her. Out in the distance, somewhere beneath the setting sun, the armies of the Fire Nation marched to war, carving death and destruction upon the land in their wake. Such wanton evil was sure to draw the one she sought, the devil she had sworn to hunt across the very reaches of time and space, like a shark to fresh blood. Yet the great walls built to protect the city she lived in caged her, trapping her from chasing her divine destiny. If only she had been born an earthbender like her father. One powerful enough to join the military and fight back against the darkness. Then she would surely be able to find and defeat the devil once and for all. Unbidden, the words formed together on her lips into a quiet prayer. "O Lord, I pray to you to grant me the power I need to fight the devil." And in that moment she could swear that a voice, deep and ancient, rumbled up to her from beneath the earth. "Rock shall part at your passing. Stone shall shatter at your fury. Earth shall bend at your will. For I have heard you once again, my chosen one. And by my will it shall be done." Don't forget to leave a review for the story in the review section, and throw power stones to elevate the ranking. Chapter 12. War, Tanya mused, was a heck of a lot less stressful when your side was winning. Now at the age of 14, Tanya had served in the Navy for over a year. And what a good year it had been. There had been a couple of naval battles, but Tanya's assumption that the Earth Kingdom would not focus its efforts so much upon maintaining a strong navy had proven correct. The only combat she saw was attacks on lone ships and the occasional raid on seaside settlements, which was less of a battle and more akin to piracy. Child's play to the battlefields she'd seen in her second life. Most of the time their missions were to escort supply ships. With a number of achievements under her belt and a commander like Zhao, who was more than eager to report back to command how instrumental Tanya had been to their victories, she'd quickly found herself bumped up to the rank of captain. Technically speaking, she now commanded Agelin's Revenge, although since Zhao chose to maintain it as his flagship she did not have the ultimate authority to control its destination or troops that she'd have liked. Their current assignment was her personal favorite, guard duty. Henge Harbor was a port town in the southwestern Earth Kingdom that had been captured by the Fire Nation fairly early on into the war, and had quickly been converted into a major military base. Its close proximity to Southern Water Tribe territory had made it ideally placed to channel fresh troops and supplies against two enemy nations, and it had been subjected to such rapid development over the years that now little but a shadow remained of the original Earth Kingdom architecture. Commander Zhao had all the ships under his command harbored here for protection while a formidable army nearby was preparing itself to march in conquest towards Omashu. It was as Tanya was enjoying this rare moment of peace, feet up on her desk as she lazily signed off stacks of paperwork, that a sharp knock on the door caught her attention. "Enter." The door opened to reveal one of the dockside clerks, who quickly snapped into a salute. "Captain, there's a vessel pulling into harbor." "And?" Tanya raised a questioning eyebrow. The arrival of one ship wasn't something that needed to be brought to her attention. "Well, Captain, it's a very outdated model. From the early years of the war if I'm not mistaken. And badly damaged at that." "Okay, admittedly that was unusual." Tanya was never one to advocate wasting resources, but even so she hadn't been aware that there was such an outdated ship even serving in the Navy. There was a possibility that this was part of some trick, but if so Tanya couldn't fathom what its purpose would be. This was worth investigating. Very well, I'll head over. Commander Zhao had already been informed. He is en route now. With a nod of acknowledgement, Tanya fixed her cap on her head and set out to the harbor. Wherever she went soldiers snapped to attention and saluted her. Before long she arrived at the harbor, just in time to catch three familiar figures in a tense conversation. That's quite a bit of damage. Commander Zhao drawled, eyeing the newly arrived ship warily. Understatement of the year. The ship, which was indeed of the smaller and less threatening models used nearly 100 years ago, was littered with dents and deep gashes, as if it had gone toe-to-toe with a sea monster and lost. Yes, you wouldn't believe what happened, replied a gruff teenage voice in an attempt at a sincere tone that just screamed lying. He always had been the most atrocious liar. Uncle. Tell Commander Zhao what happened. Prince Zuko, for that was indeed who the mystery ship seemed to belong to, had grown up during his 2 years in exile. And not just in the sense that he was taller. Time at sea had stolen away the softness from his body, leaving him with sharper features and a leaner build. There was a hardness to his stance now too, an aggression that she'd never seen during his younger years, and a wariness in his eyes that spoke of the difficult trials he'd no doubt faced. The most noticeable difference however was, without a shadow of a doubt, the scar. Tanya had not been witness to that infamous Agni Kai, or the events that preceded it, but Angela had explained what happened to her. 3 years ago Zuko had decided to sit in one of the Fire Lord's war councils. Whatever strategies had been discussed there had to be kept top secret, but apparently Zuko had insulted the honor of the Fire Nation army by implying that they were weak and should retreat from an enemy force they clearly outnumbered. As tradition dictated, Fire Lord Ozai had no choice but to challenge his son to an Agni Kai. Agni Kais were a tricky custom. They were considered fights of honor, and though there was no legal set of rules governing them, traditionally an Agni Kai was only won when one opponent burnt the other. It was also acceptable to spare your opponent or duel them to the death, but most of the nation regarded these outcomes as too soft and too cruel respectively. It was well known that when his Agni Kai had begun, Zuko had immediately dropped to his knees and begged his father for forgiveness. Angela claimed that Zuko's courage had simply deserted him once it had sunk in just how much danger he'd put himself in, though Tanya suspected there was more to it than that. There were few people for whom the idea of attacking their own family would sit well. Yet Ozai had not challenged his son in a personal capacity, for it was not his personal honor that had been insulted. It was the honor of the Fire Nation military that Zuko had insulted, and as the ultimate head of the military Ozai had to act in a way befitting the Fire Lord. To have accepted his son's forfeit with a slap of the wrist would have set a precedent that it was okay to dishonor the military, and would have had the people up in arms at such a blatant show of familial favoritism. For the sake of upholding the traditions of the nation Ozai had no choice but to settle the Agni Kai in the customary way, by burning his opponent. It had not been an act of cruelty, but of duty. Politics had tied Ozai's hands. Back in the homeland, with Zuko not around and Angela there to explain it to her, Tanya had swallowed that explanation easily enough. Now though, seeing the result of that fateful day forever painted across the face of a childhood friend, something about it just didn't sit right. Did Ozai really have to burn him quite so badly? It was a miracle that Zuko could see out of that eye at all. By Zuko's side stood former General Iroh, whose face passed through a myriad of comical expressions as his nephew put him on the spot to explain the state of their ship. Yes. I will do that. It was incredible. The elderly man exclaimed, before leaning closer to Zuko and not so subtly muttering. What, did we crash or something? Yes. Zuko continued. Right into an Earth Kingdom ship. Really? Zhao, unsurprisingly, sounded skeptical. You must regale me with all the thrilling details. Join me for a drink. Zuko glared at him and made to leave. Sorry, but we have to go. Zuko. Show Commander Zhao your respect. Iroh admonished, stopping his ward with a hand on the shoulder. We would be honored to join you. Do you have any ginseng tea? It's my favorite. Then please, allow me to escort you. All eyes turned her way as Tanya made her presence known. It was interesting to see the different reactions from the three men, delight from Zhao, shock from Zuko, and a blend of surprise and concern from Iroh. Hello Zuko. You've grown. Tanya. What are you doing here? Zuko gasped. Really? Did the uniform not make it obvious? Captain Tanya has been serving under my command for a year now. Zhao answered smugly. Captain. That's quite the achievement for one so young. Iroh said, bowing his head to her politely. It is a pleasure to see you again, Tanya. Likewise. Tanya replied, her tone curt and her bow a little stiffer. If Iroh picked up on her distaste for him, he did an excellent job of hiding it. You know, I've heard rumors of a young lady with golden hair serving in the navy. One who they call the fairy. That wouldn't happen to be you, would it? Tanya grimaced. Unfortunately so. Of all the nicknames that could have followed her from her previous life, why did it have to be that one? Argent had sounded so much better. Of course, I hear they have a different name for you in the Earth Kingdom. Iroh continued, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second. The Devil of the South Sea. They did? That was news to her. Was it too much to ask for an epithet that didn't refer to some form of supernatural creature? Or better yet, one that didn't have anything to do with war whatsoever? She'd much rather be famed for her exceptional personnel management skills. You're very knowledgeable about Earth Kingdom rumors. Tanya shot back. Iroh shrugged. We've heard things here and there during our travels. Yes, I'm sure the pair of you have had quite a few adventures over the years. Tanya replied suspiciously. Suddenly she turned on her heel and began walking away. Come, the officers' quarters are this way. I'd love to hear all about your journey. Chapter 13. And by year's end, the Earth Kingdom capital will be under our rule. The Fire Lord will finally claim victory in this war. Zuko had to fight down the urge to scoff. As always, the strategies of Zhao and so many other commanders in the Fire Nation military looked at the war as if it was in black and white, a game where all you had to do to win was to destroy your opponents. To them it didn't matter how much of the world was destroyed in the process, or how many soldiers were sacrificed along the way. If my father thinks the rest of the world will follow him willingly, then he is a fool. He sneered. Zuko. Tanya rebuked strictly, like a mother scolding an unruly child. Do not speak about your father like that. Zuko huffed, but once again found himself looking away uncomfortable from those intense yellow eyes of hers. Normally he'd be the last person to speak against his father, but right now his nerves were tense enough to play a violin on. After 2 years of desperate, fruitless searching and empty hope, he'd finally done what many thought was impossible, he'd found the Avatar. And not only that, but a child Avatar who, as of yet, only seemed to know how to airbend. The shame of not only having allowed a child to escape his grasp, but damage his ship so badly in the process, stung his pride like the bite of a snake wasp. And to make matters worse, Zhao was now sniffing around. That man's nose for glory was keener than any hunting dog's, and he would be just as tenacious as one if he finally caught the scent. Trying to stay calm and act natural when his nerves were a restless wreck was a difficult task for Zuko, and he hated how Uncle made it look so easy. If Zhao found out that the Avatar was back, then there was no doubt that he'd set off in pursuit as well, hoping to claim the prestige of capturing the Fire Nation's greatest enemy for himself. Zhao would be a tough competitor to beat, not because the man was much of a threat by himself, but because of the resources he had at his disposal, a small fleet of ships, hundreds of soldiers, and her. Agni, please, don't make me have to compete against Tanya. Even after being made tougher than ever by the trials he'd faced throughout his exile, Zuko still felt a shock of fear whenever Tanya was nearby. Who didn't these days? She was a psychopath. In the Earth Kingdom they whispered that she'd laughed with glee as she'd burned the crew of a ship alive, and from what he knew of Tanya, Zuko wouldn't put it past her. To think that she'd become Zhao's right-hand woman. If she'd been the one to capture the Avatar back at the South Pole, the first thing she'd have done would probably have been to break his arms and legs to prevent him from escaping. 2 years at sea have done little to temper your tongue. Zhao jeered, coming to sit beside him. So, how is your search for the Avatar going? Zhao was interrupted as Uncle knocked over a stack of pole arms, the commotion drawing Zhao and Tanya's searching gazes away for the couple of seconds Zuko needed to breathe deeply and regain his composure. Zhao snorted condescendingly at Uncle's clumsiness, and shared a brief eye roll with Tanya before looking back to him. By that point Zuko's expression was as schooled as he could make it. We haven't found him yet. He replied evenly, doing his best impersonation of Angela when she was trying to look sincere. Hardly surprising. Tanya interjected. If they aren't dead already they must be what, 90? 100 by now? They clearly have no interest in participating in the war, and could blend in anywhere as long as TH000EY avoid bending in public. It's not like they're going to have the words "I'm the Avatar" tattooed on their forehead. Oh Tanya! If only you knew. Unless you've found some evidence that the avatar's alive. Zhao finished, a predatory smile stretching out across his lips. Damn it, he was starting to catch hold of the truth. Mustering up memories of every time he'd been disappointed to have found no trace of the avatar in the past, Zuko allowed the hollow feelings of frustration and bitterness to seep into his voice and body language. No. Nothing. A frown crossed Zhao's face, and he stood up to lean closer towards Zuko. Prince Zuko, the Avatar's the only one who can stop the Fire Nation from winning this war. If you have an ounce of loyalty left, you'll tell me what you've found. With all due respect Andal RXRR, I think that's enough. Tanya said neutrality, unexpectedly speaking in his defense. I know Zuko, and he isn't selfish. If he knew something that would endanger the Fire Nation, he'd tell us. A worm of guilt began to wiggle in Zuko's gut, but luckily Zhao was too busy turning away to shoot Tanya a sharp look to notice. People change, Captain. Sensing an opportunity to leave, Zuko stood up and began marching over to the door. Come on uncle, we're going. He called. The sooner they could get away from Zhao's inquisition the better. Yet just before he could get through the door, the guards standing on either side lowered their pole arms to block his exit, and another soldier who'd just passed through spoke up. As the words left the soldier's lips Zuko felt his spirits plummet. Commander Zhao, we interrogated the crew as you instructed. They confirmed that Prince Zuko had the Avatar in custody, but let him escape. Damn it! For once in his life could the spirits just let something go his way. Zuko. Tanya began, eyes wide with shock, and oddly enough a hint of betrayal if he wasn't mistaken. Now remind me. Zhao smirked slowly, smugness just oozing in through his tone. How exactly was your ship damaged? Tanya was not angry. She was not. And she'd set on fire anyone who dared to imply it. Once the cat was out of the bag, Zuko had come clean about what caused the damage to his ship. The Avatar. Alive. And as a 12-year-old boy no less. She could understand him wanting to capture the Avatar himself, but to think he'd put the Fire Nation at risk by keeping it a secret. Didn't he realize that his father would have enough of an excuse to end his exile if he just helped capture the Avatar? It was upsetting to think that he'd lied to her face, endangered his nation, just for his own stubborn pride. You're angry. Zhao noted sagely, as if it wasn't obvious from her murderous expression. Once the secret was out, she and Zhao had rushed off to begin getting the fleet ready to mobilize. If they were lucky they could still pick up the Avatar's trail before he vanished deeper into the Earth Kingdom. With the first set of preparations completed, Zhao was now returning to the officers' quarters to inform Zuko and Iroh of when they'd be released, with Tanya marching at his side like an ever-faithful shadow. Really? What gave it away? She replied sarcastically, only to regret it as Zhao sent another sharp look her way. I've never seen you speak to me like this before, Captain. You're usually the first to give superiors the respect they're due. What's changed? Tanya was silent for a minute, before letting out a frustrated sigh. There was no point in keeping her feelings bottled up. Zhao had proven himself to be a kind mentor and a loyal confidant over the years. He was someone she could trust. I'm just disappointed. In Zuko, I mean. I've always known honor was very important to him, but I didn't know it'd make him so blind to his duty to his people. Zhao scoffed. Zuko's always been weak. If he hadn't had the strength to defeat a 12-year-old child, he should have at least had the courage to admit to his failure. He's not weak. Tanya replied, heat seeping into her tone. Whatever he may have done, Zuko was still a friend. His strengths just lay in other areas. No. Zhao seemed amused. Did I ever tell you that I was there to witness the prince's Anji-kai? No. No he hadn't. Tanya fell silent, but Zhao pressed onward. It was a disgraceful display, Tanya. At the mere sight of his father he fell to his knees, weeping and trembling like a newborn baby. That's why the Fire Lord banished him. He doesn't have the mettle to be the ruler our nation would need him to be one day. Wait, was that why Zuko had been banished after his Agni Kai? Had he really acted so poorly that Oze had decided he needed to make Azula his heir instead, and resolved to banish Zuko until he could safely pass the throne over to his daughter? That did make an uncomfortable amount of sense. Academically speaking Azula had the qualities of a better ruler, and Oze always prioritized his duty as the Fire Lord first and foremost. Chapter 14. Wait, was that why Zuko had been banished after his Agni Kai? Had he really acted so poorly that Oze had decided he needed to make Azula his heir instead, and resolved to banish Zuko until he could safely pass the throne over to his daughter? That did make an uncomfortable amount of sense. Academically speaking, Azula had the qualities of a better ruler, and Oze always prioritized his duty as the Fire Lord first and foremost. Sensing that his words had gotten through to her, Zhao continued walking, and soon had led them back to the officers' quarters. He pushed through the doors and addressed Zuko and Iroh in the no-nonsense tone he used when addressing most of his soldiers. "My search part is ready. Once I'm out to sea, my guards will escort you back to your ship, and you'll be free to go." Zuko had maintained such a deep frown since having the truth dragged out of him that Tanya thought he looked wrinklier than a sour plum. Yet it turned out that he could get even frownier still. His face took on a mottled red hue as he glared hatefully at Zhao. "Why? Are you worried I'm going to try and stop you, Zuko?" Tanya admonished, not in the mood to put up with his attitude any longer. "Commander Zhao had been kind enough to let you go despite your previous deception, and even had your ship repaired and resupplied. Don't you think you owe him at least a little gratitude?" "Gratitude?" Zuko snapped, standing up and fixing his glare on her. "You're going to try and steal the Avatar from me, and you expect me to be grateful? He isn't yours, Zuko. You had your chance, and you failed." Tanya snapped back, losing her cool in the face of Zuko's selfishness. "Are we supposed to sit around and do nothing as the Avatar travels the world building his power, all so that you alone can get another shot at being the one to capture him? Open your eyes, Zuko. The Avatar is more than just a powerful bender, he's a symbol that all the other remaining nations can rally behind. The longer he remains free, the greater the chances that he'll cause serious setbacks to our invasion plans." Zuko snarled. "Father tasked me with the duty of capturing the Avatar. Me alone. I don't need you two getting in my way." Zhao laughed loudly. "Ha! I think you'll find that you are one getting in our way. Don't underestimate me, Zhao. I will capture the Avatar before you." "Prince Zuko. That's enough." Iroh warned, but went ignored. "You can't compete with me." Zhao gloated mockingly, looking down on the banished prince as if he were a particularly disgusting insect. "I have hundreds of warships under my command, and the Devil of the South Sea. And you? You're just a banished prince. No home, no allies, your own father doesn't even want you." "Okay, that was taking things a bit too far now." Tanya stepped forward, intending to start defusing the situation, but there was no stopping Zuko. "You're wrong!" he shouted. "Once I deliver the Avatar to my father, he will welcome me home with honor, and restore my rightful place on the throne." Zhao sneered at him. "If your father really wanted you home, he would have let you return by now, Avatar or no Avatar. But in his eyes you are a failure, and a disgrace to the Fire Nation." "That's not true. You have the scar to prove it." All of a sudden Zuko was yelling, and had closed the gap between him and Zhao. Instinctively Tanya shifted into a fighting stance, ready to move if Zuko proved foolish enough to attack a commander in the middle of his own garrison, but fortunately Zuko had enough sense to restrain himself inches away from Zhao's face. "Maybe you'd like one to match. Is that a challenge?" Zhao scoffed disbelievingly. Zuko nodded fiercely and Agni Kai. "At sunset." What? Was he insane? Zhao didn't get to be a commander by lazing around on a beach. He may use the orthodox military style of firebending, but Tanya could personally attest that Zhao was no slouch when it came to fighting. Once he got into a good rhythm, Zhao hit hard and fast, more than enough to overwhelm someone as inexperienced as Zuko. She had to stop this. "Enough of this!" she shouted, trying to physically push her way between the two men, and cursing her height since even when she did so they could still glare at one another over her head. "Commander, please forgive him. He doesn't know what he's saying." Yet if Zhao had heard her he didn't acknowledge it. Instead he kept his stare fixed on Zuko, and a wicked smile danced at the edges of his mouth. "It's a shame your father won't be here to watch me humiliate you," he said at last, turning away to leave. "I guess your uncle will do." "Come on, Captain." Zhao disappeared back through the doors, and Tanya sent Zuko one last irritated look. Now the idiot was going to get himself badly burned again unless she could do something about it. She quickly darted outside and caught up with Zhao before he could storm further away. "Sir, I beg you to reconsider," she began, but paused when Zhao raised his hand in silence. "I was not the one who issued this challenge, Captain, and will not sully my honor by backing out of it." He chuckled. "Besides, this will be a good lesson for him to get the message to stay out of my way, and for you to see just what a coward your friend really is. Tanya bit her lip, but had to concede that, as the one who had not issued the challenge, the onus was not on Zhao to withdraw it. Would you at least not hurt him too badly? For me. Zhao did not answer. Remember your fire-bending basics, Prince Zuko. They are your greatest weapons. The orange light of sunset cast long shadows along the walls of the arena, bathing the ground in a fiery hue. With clear skies and a glistening ocean nearby, it was set to be a beautiful evening. How sad it was, Iroh reflected, that such a lovely sight was soon to be marked by senseless violence. Agni Kais really were a detestable custom in his opinion, even back before one robbed the happiness and birthright of his nephew. He could accept that there were times where one had to stand up and fight for what they believed in, but one did not need an Agni Kai to do that. How was fighting supposed to prove the honor of one's actions? Surely the only way to figure out who was in the right was with discussion and debate? Yet as ever younger men, such as Zuko and Zhao, proved too impatient to settle their differences with words. What could have been settled with a civil conversation over a nice cup of ginseng tea might now claim either one of their lives. And people said actions spoke louder than words. Pa! If people were more willing to give words a chance, perhaps the world wouldn't be stuck in this war? I refuse to let him win. Zuko declared firmly, standing up from his kneeling position before Iroh and shrugging the ceremonial cape off his torso. His resolve, as ever, was strong, but Iroh feared that resolve alone might not be enough this time. Zuko may not have possessed the raw talent his sister did, but endless nights of doggedly training and pushing himself to his limits had crafted Zuko into a much stronger firebender than he gave himself credit for. He had the strength, the skill, and the determination to defeat Zhao. The only problem was Zuko's unfortunate tendency to get lost in his own frustration so quickly that it blinded him to the wise course of action. That was how the Avatar had escaped him back at the South Pole, and how Zhao might beat him here if he didn't control himself. Across the courtyard, Zhao rose from a kneeling position in much the same way Zuko had. This will be over quickly. He mocked, tossing his robes down into the dusty ground and assuming a fighting stance. While he hated the thought of his nephew being in harm's way, Iroh had to concede that something had to be done about Zhao. There wasn't a more relentless glory seeker in the entire Fire Nation. Life would be much easier for both Zuko and the Avatar without the commander and his apprentice chasing them down. That train of thought brought Iroh's eyes to wander over Zhao's shoulder, where the little blonde girl stood at attention and watched the proceedings. It never got easier, seeing a child in a military uniform. Iroh cursed himself for allowing Oze to take yet another young girl filled with promise and twist them with his honeyed words into a tool of war. If the spirits were kind, he hoped they'd give Tanya a chance to see that the path she walked was not the one she'd led to believe it was. Sadly, he feared that chance would not be coming any time soon. The sound of a gong rang through the air, signaling that the Agni Kai had begun, and Iroh was pleased that Zuko didn't immediately rush in with flames blazing. It was a sign that he was trying his best to keep a cool head. Chapter 15. The sound of a gong rang through the air, signaling that the Agni Kai had begun, and Iroh was pleased that Zuko didn't immediately rush in with flames blazing. It was a sign that he was trying his best to keep a cool head. After a few seconds of staring each other down, Zuko pulled a fist back to build a heavy ball of fire and launched it at Zhao. The commander dodged it with practiced confidence, and continued to do so twice again as Zuko repeated the move. The fourth time Zuko launched a fireball his way, Zhao had decided that enough was enough, and settled into a firm horse stance. Rather than dodge the fireball, Zhao simply tanked it, catching the flames with his own power and dispersing them harmlessly with a flick of his arms. He smirked at Zuko tauntingly, and Iroh felt fear grip at his heart as Zuko's temper began to rise to the bait. Zuko switched to a more advanced form, leaping acrobatically and sending twirls of flame conjured from roundhouse kicks that washed across the arena like waves. Yet like a mighty ship, Zhao pushed the flames away and cut through them with the palms of his hands, still taunting Zuko with his smirk. His tactic was as obvious as it was effective: have Zuko wear himself out in his anger, then beat him down with straightforward attacks. Basics, Zuko. Break his root. Iroh shouted, hoping that his nephew would listen and remember their lessons. Even the mightiest tree would fall if you took away the roots it stood upon. It was one of the first lessons Iroh had taught him, and one he'd taken many opportunities to repeat in the hopes that it would stick. Zhao sensed his opportunity, and stepped forward into a sturdy stance as he unleashed a blast of fire at Zuko. There was nothing flashy about Zhao's attack, just a straightforward punch packed with a lot of fire, but the strength of it knocked Zuko back. Zhao took another step forward, planting his feet firmly as he followed up with another attack, which again Zuko struggled to repel. Step by step, blast by blast, Zhao advanced, hounding Zuko with an unrelenting barrage of heavy attacks. Eventually it proved to be too much, and with a grunt of pain Zuko was knocked off his feet and crashed to the floor. Yet Zhao was not prepared to let him off the hook so easily. With a war cry Zhao leapt forward, landing at a range close enough to deal Zuko a finishing blow. He brought his fists back and, with an angry roar, unleashed a great jet of fire at Zuko's head, intending to sear the flesh clean off his skull. Iroh stepped forward, instinctively moving to intervene even though all logic told him it was already too late. If Zuko did not survive this night then Agni Kai be damned, Iroh would show Zhao the reason why the Earth Kingdoms once feared him as the Dragon of the West. Yet his fears proved unnecessary. With a graceful spin that would have made an airbender proud, Zuko not only dodged out of the fire's path, but swept Zhao's feet out from under him and landed back on his own 2 feet in the process. That wasn't a fire-bending move. Iroh thought to himself, and a second later he realized where he'd seen it before, back at the South Pole. It would have made an airbender proud indeed. He'd heard it said that one learned more from their enemies than they did their friends, and if Zuko had picked up a few airbender moves from his conflict with the Avatar then he wouldn't catch him complaining. It was obvious to everyone that the tide of the battle had turned. Now it was Zuko's turn to smile as he stepped forward, not hounding away with wild blasts like Zhao had, but sending small, controlled waves of flame at Zhao's feet with each step. The result was just as effective as Zhao's mad onslaught. With his balance shot, the commander could do nothing but stumble back in a panic as Zuko claimed ground. Commander! Flares? Iroh's smile turned upside down as he remembered that he wasn't the only one allowed to call out advice, and Zhao's expression suddenly morphed from one of panic to a look of realization. He took a deep breath as he began to topple backwards, and Zuko's advance halted as he prepared himself for what he assumed was another jet of fire. Yet surprisingly it was not. As Zhao exhaled a storm of tiny sparks, each one as quick and bright as a firefly, erupted from his mouth and spread out like a cloud before him. It was a dazzling spectacle, and did a fine job of obscuring the commander from sight even as he hit the ground hard. By the time the sparks had faded enough for Zuko to see again, Zhao had already managed to stagger back up onto his feet. Iroh's frown deepened. That wasn't a move taught in the Fire Nation military. Most officers looked down on any move designed for evasion or retreat, viewing them as cowardly tricks. It surprised him that Zhao had put his pride aside long enough to learn it, but he had no doubt as to who had taught him that particular trick. Captain Tanya certainly had made some creative adaptations to the Fire Sage's style. Need a little girl to fight your battle for you, do you, Zhao? Zuko taunted. Need an old man to fight yours? Zhao shot back. Touché, Zhao. Touché. Zuko pressed the attack again, targeting Zhao's feet remorselessly with quick bolts of fire now that he'd identified his opponent's weak spot. Zhao however had wizened up to his game, and crouched low to bat aside the bolts with wide sweeps of his arms. He needed a sturdy stance to draw the most destructive power out of his style, and once again defaulted back to the tactic of letting Zuko wear himself out until the opportunity arose. Yet Zuko was having none of it. He leapt upwards, cartwheeling forward with a flame building around his foot in a clear sign that he was planning to unleash a heavy blast through an axe kick. Zhao settled back into his cross-armed horse stance, preparing to tank through the flames once again. Yet the moment his guard came up, the flames around Zuko's foot winked out, and the young prince leaned further into his kick to turn it into a forward roll. It had been a feint. By the time Zhao had realized no attack was coming and dropped his guard again, Zuko had closed the gap between them, and the fight returned to close range. This time however Zuko had the momentum. Zhao was being overly cautious, too afraid of attacks coming for his feet, and allowed himself to be caught on the defensive. Zuko meanwhile was letting his passion fuel him without clouding his head, and let his fists flow wild and free. Every so often he would make a show of aiming a fierce blast at Zhao's feet, either a genuine blast to keep him on guard, or a feint that would open a path for him to win a hit elsewhere. Zhao did a decent job at defending himself at first, but when the first punch hit him in the cheek with a satisfying crack, Iroh knew it was over. It wasn't long before 2, then 3 more strikes smashed against his torso, and as Zhao winced in pain, Zuko swept his feet out from beneath him again. Zhao hit the ground back first, too exhausted for any more tricks, and Zuko closed in and brought his fist back, ready to deliver the finishing strike. Prince and Commander glared at each other in frozen silence for a few seconds, waiting for the other to break the stalemate. What are you waiting for? Zhao demanded at last. Do it. With a growl of anger, Zuko punched forward, sending a ball of fire at Zhao's face. which exploded harmlessly against the ground beside him. Iroha's heart swelled with pride at the restraint his nephew had shown. It was a brave thing to stand up to your enemies, but braver still to spare them once you had them at your mercy. It would have been within his rights to cast a scar of Zhao's face that would match the one on his. Instead he'd done the truly honorable thing, and spared his foe from feeling the same pain he felt. That sort of selfless thinking was what it would take to end this war one day. I wish you could see this Oze. He'd make a fine Fire Lord, despite all that you've done to try and tear the kindness out of him. Evidently Zhao didn't agree. That's it. He scoffed between heavy breaths. Your father raised a coward. Yet Zuko didn't rise to the bait. Next time you get in my way I promise, I won't hold back. He replied coldly, turning to walk away. Zhao scrambled back to his feet, and from the look in his eye Iroh could tell what he was about to do. Zhao raised his foot and, with a desperate cry, launched a cowardly attack at Zuko's back as he walked away. Yet by then Iroh had crossed enough distance to intercept, and caught the offending foot with the casual ease of one who'd done it 1,000 times before. Commander! Tanya cried, only a second behind the action herself, and as Iroh pushed Zhao back to fall on the ground for a third time today he found himself quietly impressed when Tanya managed to catch and hold the fully grown man despite her small frame. A snarl informed him that Zuko had turned around, ready to finish the fight, but Iroh stuck an arm out and held his nephew back. No, Prince Zuko! Do not taint your victory! He advised sagely, and was pleased to feel the tension quickly bleed out of Zuko's body. He turned back again to fix Zhao with a flat, disapproving stare. So this is how the great commander Zhao acts in defeat. He shook his head. Disgraceful. Even in exile, my nephew is more honorable than you. Zhao, for once, seemed to be at a loss for words, his humiliation leaving him floundering in silence. Iroh nodded his head curtly. Thanks again for the tea. It was delicious. And with those parting words Iroh turned away, leading Zuko to their ship as Zhao glared at their backs hatefully. Chapter 16. That treacherous, impudent, cowardly little weasel. Tanya sighed in exasperation as Zhao ranted and raved. The commander was many things, but gracious in defeat was not one of them. She'd used to take it as a sign of his determination to win, but after today's showing she'd have to rethink that. While normally she was far from the first one to advocate doing the honorable thing, Tanya had to admit that Zhao's behavior in an Agni Kai, which was supposed to be all about proving your honor, had been unseemly. Striking at the back of an opponent who'd spared you? That was low, even for her. The next time I see him I'll decorate the other side of his face the same way his father did. Zhao continued, before rounding on her with a pointed finger. And you, Captain? What do you think you were doing sabotaging my efforts? I had him on the ropes until you offered your vaunted advice. Oh, so it was her fault now was it? They must have very different recollections of what happened, because it looked to Tanya like Zhao had been on the doorstep of failure before she'd called out to him. Yet she'd learned well enough in her first life that superiors didn't want the facts pointed out to them when they were in a mood like this. They wanted to feel like they were in control again, and there was no better way to feel authoritative than to berate a few subordinates. The best way to soothe their anger was to bow your head, tell them what they wanted to hear, and file a record to the Human Resources Department as soon as possible in case they genuinely tried to pin their failures on you. My apologies, Commander. Tanya replied dutifully, bowing lowly in a sign of subservience. I only wanted to help. I should never have presumed to offer advice to someone as knowledgeable as you. Please forgive my impertinence. Zhao snorted grumpily, but it was clear that her prostration had taken the white-hot edge off his anger. See to it that you don't, Captain. He spat her rank out venomously, and turned his back on her to face his fleet of ships. If you want to redeem yourself then personally see to it that every ship in the fleet is stocked and ready to depart at sunrise tomorrow. I don't care if the troops have to work through the night, I refuse to let the prince get a head start on capturing the Avatar. Right away, Commander. Tanya snapped a crisp salute, and marched away to leave Zhao to his brooding. Great, now Zhao was letting himself be caught up in a personal vendetta as well. Thanks ever so much for that, Zuko. This morning she'd been relaxing at her desk enjoying a nice, peaceful assignment, and now she was preparing to get dragged across the world hunting the most powerful and dangerous bender on the planet. Even if they were a 12-year-old boy who only seemed able to control one element, the fact that he could trash an entire steel warship firmly placed him in the category of someone who she did not want to tangle with. Yet orders were orders, and complaining about them had never done anything before. She'd just have to play things smart and capture the avatar outside of combat, or at the very least keep a nice, thick wall of soldiers between her and him. Maybe she'd see if she could even wrangle Zuko into an important assisting role somehow so that his father would finally have an excuse to let him come home. Her expressions sharpened as her mind turned to schemes and plans for the future. The emergence of this avatar had thrown a wrench into her carefully constructed plans for promotion, but also provided her with an opportunity. If Zhao captured the avatar with her help, then she'd be a shoo-in for his position as commander when they made him an admiral. Or perhaps the Fire Lord would make her an admiral himself. Yes, one way or another the avatar stood between her and the nice, peaceful life she dreamed of. Better watch out, avatar. The devil of the South Sea is coming for you. Weeks of searching, and nothing to show for it. Tanya's frown was beginning to become permanently etched onto her forehead. No wonder Zuko had ended up looking so mopey after dealing with this frustration for years. A heavy sigh escaped her lips as she sorted through sheet after sheet of intelligence reports sent by scouts and spies scattered across the Earth Kingdom. The last confirmed sighting of the Avatar had been by their agent in Omashu, who revealed that a young air nomad had been a guest of Mad King Bumi. After that, however, the trail had gone cold. Everything since then had just been second-hand sightings of bison-shaped clouds in the sky, and reports of suspicious activity that might be Avatar-related. Might being the term to stress, since apparently the Fire Nation soldiers in the local area had interpreted that as an excuse to send her reports about every ridiculous little thing that happened to them, claiming it was the Avatar's handiwork. A steak goes missing from a man's plate while his back is turned? Must be the Avatar. The mold on a wheel of cheese grows in the approximate shape of an arrow? Must be the Avatar. A patrol swears they see a monkey lemur earthbending? Must be the Avatar. It was ludicrous. Nonetheless, Tanya had to concede that it hadn't been an entirely wasted effort. After having discovered rumors that the Avatar had visited Kyoji Island a few days before Omashu, Tanya had been able to plot a flight path of the Avatar's journey so far from the South Pole. This map indicated that the Avatar seemed to prefer sticking to coastal areas rather than journey through the middle of the Earth Kingdom, and if he followed Tanya's predicted course would soon be nearing the stretch of ocean where the Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation landmasses were closest, Crescent Isle. Commander Zhao had set up a blockade of the area to prepare for the possibility that the Avatar would pass by, and so the past 3 days had been the world's longest, wettest, and most boring stakeout, floating still in the middle of the sea, scanning the empty sky around them for any sign of movement. Yes, hunting the Avatar was a truly exciting adventure, all right. Half the crew were already displaying the first symptoms of cabin fever, and Tanya wasn't sure she'd be too far behind them. Captain! Tanya was startled out of her thoughts as a soldier burst hurriedly into her office. She drew in a sharp breath, ready to give them the verbal thrashing of a lifetime, but was cut off by the soldier's next words. Movement in the sky to the east. We think it's the Avatar. Finally. Tanya all but screamed, jolting up from her chair and pushing the soldier aside in her hurry to get to the deck. This was perfect. Forget fighting the Avatar in some epic duel for the ages. With the fleet of ships lined up here, they could blast the sucker out of the sky with a hail of trebuchet fire before he had so much as a chance to fight back. Commander Zhao was already waiting on deck when she arrived, staring into the distance through a spyglass. Tanya took out a spyglass of her own and turned it in the same direction. It only took a few seconds of searching before she spotted a creature matching the one Zuko had described, a huge, beefy ball of fur that somehow paddled through the air like an enormously fat bee. The Avatar! She muttered triumphantly, a feeling of excitement budding in her heart at the thought of her quarry being so close. Zhao's hand reached out to push her spyglass slightly downward, fixing it upon a familiar ship of wrought black steel that chased along the sky bison's trail. And the banished prince! He muttered darkly. This must be our lucky day. Oh dear! It seemed that enough time had yet to pass for that grudge to settle. What are your orders? Tanya asked tentatively. Zhao grinned wickedly. Shoot the bison down, Captain. But sir, that's Prince Zuko's ship out there, and he's positioned for a better shot. What if we hit him by accident? So be it. Zhao's grin seemed to show a hint of teeth. It belongs to a traitor. Behind them soldiers scurried around, preparing the trebuchets for a first volley. Ignite! Zhao called, and in a flash 100 sparks produced from 100 hands fell onto 100 boulders of coal, setting them alight into blazing meteors. Launch! There was something eerily beautiful about seeing such a wide volley of fireballs launch into the sky in unison. It was like seeing a cluster of shooting stars, except that they left trails of acrid black smoke in their wake. The flying bison began to swerve in the sky, and Tanya smirked as she spotted a few close calls brush fire against the creature's fur. Fire at will! Zhao called. With the constant pressure of so much ammunition, it would only be a matter of time before one lucky shot hit the creature. At first the bison tried to go high, hiding amongst the clouds. But what good was hiding when the fleet was able to pepper the entire airspace for miles around with burning boulders? All it did was hinder the bison's ability to react, and unsurprisingly it wasn't long before they dropped back out again and instead sped down to the surface of the ocean. Taking twisting, snake-like paths, the bison swerved and swayed across the surface, narrowly missing each shot that crashed against the water. It was impressive it had held on for so long, but the closer it came to the blockade, the more accurate their shots became. Zhao held a hand up in a silent instruction for the trebuchet on the flagship to hold for his signal as the bison straightened into a last, desperate charge. Steady! Zhao muttered. The bison was close enough now for Tanya to make out 3 blurred figures on its back, 2 in blue clothing, and 1 in orange. Fire! The moment the fireball was sent soaring through the air, Tanya already knew it was going to hit. It was too fast, too precisely aimed, and the bison had not demonstrated the agility needed to avoid it earlier. With an ever-growing smile, Tanya watched as the fireball sped forward, barely noticing the orange blur begin to move before the fireball enveloped them. Bang! The fireball exploded with a rumbling crash. Yet not in the way Tanya had expected. With growing shock, Tanya watched as a ring of empty space was blasted through the cloud of fire and ash, allowing the bison to pass through the middle unharmed. So that was airbending? The records she'd read suggested it was an almost entirely evasive style of bending, but it seemed that in the hands of a monster like the Avatar even a gentle skill like that could be twisted into something destructive. The bison rocketed over the blockade, and for just a second Tanya was able to catch a glimpse of the figure sitting atop the bison's head. Zuko hadn't been lying when he said the Avatar was a young boy. He was short with a thin, acrobatic frame, which added together with his bald head and childishly round face made him seem naturally innocent. But Tanya was not fooled for a second. She knew better than anyone that looks could be deceiving. Avatar! She whispered to herself as the bison soared just a few feet above her head, kicking up a squall of wind in its wake that buffeted her golden hair into a wild mess. This isn't over. Chapter 17. The Avatar was a young boy. He was short with a thin, acrobatic frame, which added together with his bald head and childishly round face made him seem naturally innocent. But Tanya was not fooled for a second. She knew better than anyone that looks could be deceiving. Avatar! She whispered to herself as the bison soared just a few feet above her head, kicking up a squall of wind in its wake that buffeted her golden hair into a wild mess. This isn't over. In just a few seconds the bison had cleared the blockade and began to shrink into the empty blue sky of the Fire Nation. Tanya grit her teeth, and resisted the urge to stomp her foot like a petulant child. It had been so long now that she'd almost forgotten the frustration of failing a mission. The fact that it hadn't been because of anything she'd done wrong didn't make it any less vexing. Tanya was broken out of her thoughts by a large hand grasping her shoulder, and looked up at the remarkably calm face of Zhao. Strange, she would have thought he of all people would be more upset. There's no time, Captain. He stated curtly. Do you have your emergency supplies kit prepared? Yes. Tanya replied without hesitation. It was a habit she'd picked up in her second life. You never could know when an enemy invasion might suddenly force you to evacuate your current base of operations, and there was nothing worse than a lack of supplies when fleeing for your life. Tanya kept a small backpack of dried food, water, and a few other useful survival supplies ready in her office so that, in the event of an unforeseen emergency, she wouldn't have to waste vital time packing before she fled. Get it! Zhao commanded, his tone making it clear that time was of the essence. In a flash Tanya was running, pushing fully grown soldiers out in her way and clearing stairs 2 steps at a time in her haste. When she returned a minute later, backpack in hand, there was an acrid smell across the deck that stung at the corners of her eyes. It wasn't hard to spot the source. Zuko's ship had been hit by one of the projectiles they'd been flinging at the Avatar, and was now bleeding thick black smoke as it slipped narrowly between the blockade of ships. Strange, she'd been sure the blockade could have caught a ship like Zuko's, and Zhao would have loved to arrest the banished prince for breaking the terms of his exile. Unless... When Zhao approached, wearing the satisfied smile he usually wore when explaining a tactical scheme, Tanya had a pretty good idea of what he was about to say. We may not know where the Avatar is heading, Zhao began, but we can trust Zuko more than anything to doggedly pursue them until his dying breath. That smoke signal he's leaving behind will allow the main fleet to track him. His smile faltered for a moment. But with a wily ex-general like Iroh on board, I wouldn't put it past them to try some form of trickery. I want you to board Zuko's ship, stay hidden, and keep an eye on him. If something goes wrong, I trust you to make the right judgment as to what to do. Sir, yes sir. Tanya snapped into a salute, then turned crisply on her heel and sprinted towards the railing. As she passed one of the engineers, her hand shot out and pinched the welding goggles right off his head, ignoring his surprised shriek of protest, and fixed them across her eyes. Once she reached the railings, she vaulted over them in one huge leap, and for a few seconds enjoyed the thrilling sensation of gravity taking hold of her and pulling her down towards the ocean. Then jets of flame sparked to life beneath her hands and feet as she triggered her propulsion technique, and like a rocket she raced across the sea towards Zuko's ship. There weren't many circumstances where the jet propulsion technique could be used stealthily, but the dense cloud of soot and smoke that trailed along behind Zuko's injured ship like a tail provided the perfect cover. Tanya held her breath as she dove into the black cloud, her eyes thankfully protected by the pilfered goggles. Even an old warship like this one would probably be based off of the same original designs as their modern predecessors, and that meant that there should be at least one door right at the back that would lead below decks. Once her feet felt the touch of solid metal beneath them, she fumbled forward, eventually finding a metal wall and feeling her way along it until she reached the curved indentation of a doorway. The moment she was inside and had the door firmly slammed behind her, Tanya gasped for air and allowed herself to let out a hacking cough. Ugh, smoke was disgusting. A thin sheen of black grime now clung to every inch of her, and she was probably going to smell like a barbecue for the next month. Still, it was a small price to pay for a chance to capture the Avatar, she supposed. Once she'd caught her breath again, Tanya set off down the corridors in search of Zuko. It was hard not to notice how experienced Zuko's ship was. It was clear that Zuko had his crew maintain a strict cleaning routine, but cleaning could only go so far against the patches of rust and dull, flaking iron. If this was how the ship looked after it had recently been repaired, then Tanya shuddered to think what it had been like before. It was shocking that Oze had requisitioned such a shoddy ship for his son. While a small ship like this would be fine for capturing and transporting a single person, surely a task like capturing the almighty Avatar, who at the time of Zuko's banishment was believed must be some ancient, experienced waterbender, should have merited the ship to be newly refurbished and reinforced. A second later Tanya shook her head, as if to cast out those borderline treacherous thoughts. No, Oze was a practical man, and would surely have provided his son with a more suitable ship if he was able. But every ship they had was already tied up in the war effort, and Zuko's banishment had been unplanned, unexpected, and too sudden for Oze to plan ahead. This ship must have been the only option available, and any ship was better than no ship at the end of the day. The distant sound of footsteps and muttering steadily growing louder informed Tanya that someone was coming this way, and she looked around for somewhere to hide. As quietly as she could, she opened the nearest door and slid inside. The room she found herself in was some sort of office. It was almost completely bare, save for a large desk of dark brown wood blanketed by a layer of messy, disorganized papers. It made the office worker in her cringe just looking at it. The footsteps back outside the door grew closer, until eventually Tanya could discern that they belonged to not one, but two people. Is following the smoke, but perhaps we don't have to be where the smoke is. That was Zuko's voice. We know that the Avatar's bison has been traveling far and fast enough to need rest soon, but Zhao doesn't. There was a rustling of paper. A map perhaps? Look here. Crescent Island is the closest stop nearby. I'd be willing to bet that the Avatar would at least stop there to rest his mount, assuming that it's not his final destination altogether. Under the cover of the smoke I could sneak off in the landing craft, while you keep the ship heading north and lead Zhao on a wild raven goose chase. Iroh hummed, the tone of it suggesting he disapproved but was reluctant to say so directly. Tanya didn't understand why. It was an intelligent strategy, and the only realistic chance Zuko had at succeeding. A clever plan, nephew. I could turn around past the next set of islands, pick you and the Avatar up from the other side just after sunset, and then escape back into Earth Kingdom waters before Zhao could catch us. However, for this to work our timing would have to be perfect. A slight delay would leave you stranded. I fear what lengths Zhao would go to if he captures you. Are you sure this is worth the risk? I will risk anything to capture the Avatar and restore my honor. Zuko replied sharply, the increasing pace of his footsteps betraying that he'd stormed off in annoyance, leaving Iroh behind. Inform the helmsman of our course. I will prepare the landing craft. It looked like she wasn't the only one who'd smell like barbecue today after all. Zuko seemed to have developed half a mind for cunning of his own during his exile. Personally, she'd have brought a hand-picked team of elite soldiers along with her, but she couldn't fault Zuko's ability to turn the disadvantage of his damaged ship to his own benefit. It might have worked, had he not considered the possibility of a spy infiltrating his vessel. That he hadn't would spell his loss. Once the footsteps had faded into nothingness, Tanya turned to the office desk and began rummaging through it for writing utensils. With perfectly neat penmanship she wrote a note on the back of an empty slip of paper. The ship is a distraction. Zuko will sneak out under cover of the smoke. He thinks the Avatar will stop at Crescent Island. Once the note was finished, Tanya neatly folded it up and slipped it into her pocket. A quick trip to the garbage room should be enough to find an empty bottle, and then she could leave a message behind in the ocean for Zhao to pick up. Then it was onward to the vehicle bay. Hopefully Zuko had room on his landing craft for a stowaway. Chapter 18. As the faint shadow of his ship disappeared into the cloud of smoke, Zuko let out a shaky breath. He had to keep a strong face in front of his crew, in front of Uncle, but now that he was alone the stony expression he'd become so practiced at wearing began to slip a little. I won't fail again. Not this time. The words were half promise, half reassurance. It was hard to forget that power the Avatar had displayed back at the South Pole, power enough to cast dozens of soldiers off into the freezing ocean with an effortless wave of the hand. And all that was from an Avatar who'd only mastered one. Zuko would not allow himself to be deterred. No matter how strong the enemy, true strength lay in not backing down. He would not allow fear to dictate his actions. I won't fail. He spoke aloud, feeling for a moment like saying the words would help make it real. I refuse to fail. That's the spirit, Zuko. An icy bolt of dread writhed down his spine, the facade of calm and focus he'd so painstakingly built shattering at a word. No. Not her. Even his luck couldn't be that bad, could it? Yet as he turned around, Zuko remembered that he should never underestimate the spirit's love for making him suffer. For it was none other than Tanya, the devil of the South Sea herself, who stood there upon the deck of his boat as if she owned it. Our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Tanya quoted, a nostalgic smile across her face. Though it seemed gentle, Zuko could picture with perfect clarity how easily it would stretch back into a manic grin when the scent of blood was in the air. The first words I ever said to you, remember? It feels like that day was so long ago. You've really grown up since then. I know many fully grown men who would envy your resolve. All pretenses of informality suddenly drained from Tanya's face, leaving it the perfect mask of professionalism. However, as much as I hate to break it to you, Zuko, this is bigger than you. Bigger than your pride. A fully realized Avatar is quite possibly the only thing capable of turning the tides of this war. The Fire Nation cannot afford to leave it to one teenager, who has yet to even fully master one element himself, to be solely responsible for his capture. She stepped forward, eyes softening slightly in what could almost be mistaken for genuine concern. Be reasonable, Zuko. Zhao has the resources and men needed to capture the Avatar while it's still possible to do so, and together with your experience and knowledge we'd have him in custody before sunrise tomorrow. The Fire Lord will still honor you for being a part of his capture. There's no need to fight this battle all by yourself. She extended an open hand towards him. An offer of peace. Please, Zuko, this feud is pointless. Come and work with us. Work with your homeland. That was just another of Tanya's talents. She had a way of making everything seem so clear, so logical, when she made a speech, and knew how to inject just the right level of emotional blackmail into her words to make not agreeing with her feel like being pointlessly petty. Zuko had to admit that a lot of her argument made sense. However, he also knew how to spot the gaping hole in her reasoning, no matter how many sweet words she tried to cover it with. Zhao would never share glory. Zuko stated defiantly. The moment the Avatar was in custody he'd turn on him too, and weave lie after lie about how he'd caught them both single-handedly. A harsh frown sunk across Tanya's face. You underestimate him. No, you overestimate him. Tanya stood silently for a moment, yellow eyes boring into his. Then with deliberate slowness she retracted her hand. So that's how it has to be, is it? For perhaps the first time in his life, Zuko held her gaze head-on. He would not allow fear to rule him ever again, be that fear of the Avatar, Azula, or even Tanya. It is. I see. Tanya's neutral expression betrayed nothing about what she was feeling. I suppose that means that we're enemies now, doesn't it? Zuko tensed, preparing for a fight. I suppose it does. Very well then. Tanya stood a little straighter, eyes glassy and unfocused for just a fraction of a second, before they morphed into a piercing glare. Then I suppose, in the interest of being a good sport, I should mention that your little deception has failed. I've dropped Admiral Zhao a message to let him know just where the Avatar is headed. A sly smirk slithered across her lips. I wonder who will catch him first? You? Zhao? Or me? No. Zuko leapt forward, realizing what was about to happen, but it was already too late. With a blast of flames beneath each foot, Tanya took to the sky, rocketing off in the direction of the fire temple. Better hurry up, Zuko. Tanya called back as she raced off into the distance. Time certainly isn't on your side. Damn it! Zuko yelled, racing back to the ship's engine and turning it to full power. Damn the spirits for throwing obstacle after obstacle in his way. Damn Tanya for sabotaging his plan. And damn himself for not being careful enough to realize it. Now he not only had to catch the Avatar before Tanya, who had a head start, but also keep him from Zhao, who would only be a few minutes behind. It would be tricky, impossible even, some would say. But he refused to give up. No matter the odds stacked against him, he would not fail. Not this time. That stupid, arrogant, hot-headed jerk. Tanya was still in a foul mood by the time her feet touched down on Crescent Island, right in front of the doors of the fire temple. She felt like she had every right to be mad, all things considered. Why was Zuko so set on acting like a short-sighted, angsty maverick? He wouldn't see good sense if it paraded around in front of him dressed like a clown. Well, fine. If he was so determined to capture the Avatar alone, then he'd have nobody but himself to blame when she and Zhao beat him to it. Perhaps another couple of years exiled at sea would teach him to be a team player? With an angry shove, Tanya pushed open the heavy doors of the fire temple, and was utterly unsurprised by what she found inside. Fire sages ran here and there like ants, worriedly chattering about the Avatar and searching in random directions. It was painfully obvious that not only was the Avatar here, but that the fire sages were completely disorganized in their efforts to apprehend him. They hadn't even noticed her walk in for pity's sake. A stomp of her foot, accompanied by a bright flash of fire, soon put a stop to that. All eyes turned to her in a heartbeat, conversations drying up like water in the desert, and a flicker of satisfaction sparked through Tanya as she noticed how the sage's eyes widened at the sight of her golden hair. Even here at Crescent Island, everyone recognized the golden child of the High Temple at a glance. What? Tanya began with deliberate slowness, pacing her words out at just the right speed to command their attention. A shameful display. The Avatar arrives, and what do you do? She cast a critical eye across the crowd, noting how many of the sages looked down when her eyes met theirs. You panic. You blunder. You charge around like disorganized rabble, providing exactly the chaos the Avatar needs to slip through your temple unseen. Have you no leader? No common sense? It must have been a surreal sight to any onlookers, watching a tiny girl just entering her teenage years talk down to a room of shamefaced old men. Eventually one of the older sages, dressed in the ceremonial robes that Tanya knew denoted him as the high sage of this temple, stepped forward. Lady Tanya, please understand. When the Avatar arrived we had him cornered, and yet somehow he was able to vanish into thin air. Tanya fixed her gaze on the elderly man until he looked away nervously. What is your name? She eventually asked. High Sage Rafik. And tell me, High Sage, Tanya continued. Have you been able to ascertain why the Avatar has shown up here? Rafik nodded quickly, desperate to show some worth. We believe he is attempting to contact Avatar Roku. Past avatars have been able to learn rare, forgotten techniques by communicating with and studying under their own past lives. We believe Avatar Roku may be attempting to impart a technique onto the new avatar that will help him slay the Fire Lord. Okay, that did sound worrying. In her first life she would have laughed in the face of anyone stupid enough to believe in reincarnation, spirits, or any of that mystical mumbo-jumbo. However, that was before she met Being X. Tanya believed in the spirits. A group of intangible, otherworldly beings of dubious moral character that took great pleasure in meddling with the affairs of another world and demanding its inhabitants worship them. Yep, it sounded rather familiar actually. She had also decided long ago that the lot of them could go fuck themselves. What right did the spirits have to demand worship from humans? To claim areas like forest and mountains as their holy territory, when they themselves were foreigners to the world of man? Historically, the actions they were credited for seemed suspiciously to Tanya like attempts to curtail humanity's attempts to make industrial progress. And why wouldn't they? After all, her first world was evidence enough that as science and industry grew, the need to worship spirits or other such beings as gods plummeted. Chapter 19. Historically, the actions they were credited for seemed suspiciously to Tanya like attempts to curtail humanity's attempts to make industrial progress. And why wouldn't they? After all, her first world was evidence enough that as science and industry grew, the need to worship spirits or other such beings as gods plummeted. Tanya considered herself smart enough to not buy into the majority of Fire Nation propaganda, but she had to admit that, from a purely logical standpoint, the Fire Nation's reasoning for starting this war as a means of sharing their prosperity with the world wasn't inaccurate. The Fire Nation was easily the most technologically advanced nation in the world, and were already spreading their technology into their colonized territories. When they did win the war, the world would definitely enter a new era of scientific progress. It would have been preferable if this technology had been spread through diplomacy and trade rather than murder, but Tanya had been born 100 years too late to do anything about that. The war had gone on too long to end with anything but the Fire Nation's overwhelming victory of crushing defeat by now. Peace was too distant a memory for all but a handful of the elderly to remember. In a world unified by the Fire Nation, the spirits would lose their grip on the faith of the masses in a couple of generations. No wonder then that they would send the Avatar, their great champion, to oppose the Fire Nation. Send their cosmic-powered living superweapon into the fray, and if he managed to succeed, not only would humanity be fractured into a handful of squabbling factions once again, but all nations would remember to fear the power of the spirits. If Avatar Roku did have some sneaky trick up his sleeve that might help his new incarnation defeat Oze, then it was a matter of national priority to stop their meeting from happening. Why come here? Where in this temple would the Avatar be able to contact Roku? Tanya demanded. There is a statue of Roku in a hidden shrine deep within the temple, a place where the boundary between this world and the spirit world is thinner than usual. In just a few minutes, the peak of the winter solstice will begin, and at that point the connection this temple shares to the spirit world will be at its strongest. If the Avatar enters the shrine, it would be easier than ever for him to contact Roku. Rafik hurriedly explained. Tanya's glare redoubled in intensity. That's it? Then why haven't you set guards outside this shrine? The shrine is protected by a great door. It would take a fully realized Avatar, or 5 master firebenders working together to open it. And what about the walls? Tanya spat back, tapping her foot against the distinctly stone floor for emphasis. We're in a volcano, which is made of earth, and the Avatar is capable of learning earthbending. What's to stop him from carving a tunnel around the door? Rafik began sweating profusely. We hadn't considered that. Then pray for your sake that the Avatar hasn't either. Tanya snarled, striding forwards further into the temple. Bring your strongest men and lead me to this shrine. You're all under my command now. The further down into the volcano they walked, the hotter the air became. Tanya shot wary glances at the streams of running lava they passed by, wondering how the plans for this building ever made it past health and safety, when suddenly a loud bang echoed out from up ahead. Without needing a command, Tanya and the sages raced forward. Before long, the huge doors of the shrine, locked by some complicated-looking maze of pipes stylized to look like serpentine dragons, loomed before them, and Tanya was surprised to find a fire sage already waiting for them. Come quickly! The sage called. The Avatar has entered the sanctuary. Immediately the sages rushed forwards to investigate. How did he get in? Rafik asked. I don't know. But look at the scorch marks. And down there. Tanya cast a critical eye over the doors. There was indeed a fresh layer of blackened ash where fire had incinerated the coating of dust that lingered on the ancient doors. Not only that, but a shadow could be seen moving around underneath the doors. Something was moving around inside. The solstice hasn't reached us yet. There's still time. Tanya announced, striking a fire-bending stance. With me. We'll open these doors and drag him out. The other sages formed ranks around her, and as one all punched forward, unleashing powerful yet controlled jets of flames into each of the pipes on the door's intricate locking mechanism. With a heavy rumble, the locks began to turn and clang, ancient gears twisting for the first time in decades, as the door swung open. To reveal a monkey lemur. For a second, Tanya's brain whirled to a complete halt as she tried to process what she was seeing. Was it a coincidence? No, it couldn't be. How could she have been so blind? Zuko had told her that the Avatar traveled with a pet monkey lemur, and only a few days ago she'd received that report about a monkey lemur seen earthbending. That could only mean one thing. The Avatar's lemur can earthbend. She gasped, horrified at the implications of this discovery. He must have used it to dig a tunnel around the door. Actually, I think it must have just crawled in through the pipes. One of the sages replied. Oh. Yeah, that would make more sense actually. Wait, but that would mean we've been tricked. Ambush. Yet it was too late. Before the words had even left her lips, the unmistakable sound of a commotion stirred behind her. The fire sage who'd called them over was restraining Rafik, while young teenagers from the water tribe had emerged from behind the nearby pillars to restrain the other three. Tanya's feet shifted into a new position, preparing to fire precise bolts of flames at the ambushers' faces, when a blur of white fur suddenly struck her directly in the face. Get off me! She yelled, her voice muffled by the body of the monkey lemur that had attached itself to her face. As she thrashed around, trying to break the lemur's unexpectedly strong grip on her hair, she heard a girl's voice shout. Now Aang! The Avatar was going to slip in through the doors she had opened for him. She couldn't let that happen, but neither could she see anything with this fucking lemur in her face. Yet there was no gust of air whooshing by as the Avatar seized the opportunity. No hurried footsteps as he sprinted past. Aang! Now's your chance! The girl's voice called out again in confusion. Then came another unexpected voice. A familiar, half-raspy tone that Tanya wasn't sure if she was glad to hear right now. The Avatar is coming with me. Zuko. He'd caught up already. Seemed that the prince had learned to work quickly under pressure. Finally able to get a grasp on the monkey lemur's tail, Tanya ripped the filthy pest off her face and let it dangle in the air. Around her the other sages were able to turn the tables in their ambushers and twist them into holds of their own. Close the doors, quickly. The other sages froze, and looked to her for instructions as Zuko said those words. Tanya glanced over at the banished prince, who had indeed been able to grapple the Avatar into a double arm lock. For a moment her fresh anger from earlier returned, causing spiteful thoughts to surface in her mind. It would be but the work of a moment to subdue Zuko, await Zhao's arrival and claim the glory of capturing the Avatar for themselves. Yet just as soon as they came Tanya banished those thoughts, determined not to let personal feelings get in the way of duty. They had their victory, any infighting now would only create opportunities for the Avatar to slip away. Let Zuko take the credit for the capture and regain his birthright. She would still receive some acclaim for assisting. Besides, she had the monkey lemur. She was going to enjoy cooking the little pest after the humiliation it put her through. Very well, she replied, nodding to the sages. Close it. One of the sages pulled a length of chain out from under his robes, and Tanya did not want to think about why he'd thought to keep those there, and began to fasten the two water tribe kids to a pillar, while another began to close the door. Tanya, meanwhile, looked down at the monkey lemur, and an evil grin spread across her face as she conjured a ball of fire above her other hand. Now then, let's find out what roast lemur tastes like. Chapter 20. Tanya, meanwhile, looked down at the monkey lemur, and an evil grin spread across her face as she conjured a ball of fire above her other hand. Now then, let's find out what roast lemur tastes like. The monkey lemur started screeching and writhing frantically in her grip, but could not escape Tanya's hold. Grinning wickedly, Tanya brought the fireball close enough to singe some of its hairs. Only for her eyes to be drawn away at the sound of Zuko yelling in a mix of pain and fury. The Avatar was free, having managed to throw Zuko down a flight of stairs, and was charging straight for her. Immediately she relinquished her grip on the lemur and slid into a fire-bending pose, but by then it was already too late. The Avatar was fast. Moving with the speed of the howling winds themselves, he dodged past her, ducked through the legs of one sage, and sprang over the shoulder of another. He was going for the door, which had still yet to fully close. Go! The captive water tribe girl shouted, at exactly the same time that Tanya shouted no. Flames burst to life beneath her feet, and Tanya used the jet propulsion technique to surge forward, literally hot on the heels of the Avatar as he made a last, desperate jump towards the door. Carried by a gust of wind, the Avatar slid through the narrowly closing crack in the door. A fraction of a second later Tanya, for once grateful for her small stature, slid in after him. And with an ominous clunk the doors closed and locked shut, trapping the two young benders inside. Aang looked wide-eyed around the room he found himself in. Was it the Fire Nation's forgotten reverence, or Roku's own humility that caused his shrine to be so lacking in wealth? The shrine was mostly hewn from the stone around it, and sparingly decorated with rich red tapestries and other small items that must have meant something to Roku in life. Personally, Ong preferred it this way. It felt more personal, like a reflection of the man Roku had been rather than a gaudy display of past wealth. At the center of the shrine stood a statue of Avatar Roku, and a red beam of light trickling in through a window in the ceiling above traced a lazy path across the statue's body up towards the head. Thunk! As the doors clanked shut behind him, Ong heard another sound, the clinking of metal armor, and quickly twisted around to discover that he wasn't as alone in here as he'd thought. The golden-haired firebender from outside, the one who'd appeared leading the fire sages yet was herself dressed in military armor, had also slipped in through the doors behind him. Slowly the girl stood up, her eyes instantly locking onto him with a fierce glare. "Now hold on," Ong said in what he hoped was a calming tone, his hands held out defensively in front of him. "There's no need for us to fight." If the girl had acknowledged what he said, she didn't show it, instead keeping that same frosty glare on him as she slid into a fighting stance. Sensing trouble, Ong slid into a stance of his own. "I mean it. We're both trapped in here until the end of the solstice anyway. Why don't we sit down and talk? And give you all the time you need to consult with Roku about how to kill the Fire Lord?" Tanya asked sarcastically, clenching her fists. "I don't think so." Suddenly she sprang into action, punching forward to unleash a straight jet of fire. Ong spun on his heel to avoid it and darted to the side, using a gust of air to carry himself further away and up into the air. It had been nearly 100 years since the extinction of the air nomads, and in that time the world had forgotten how to fight airbenders. Masters neglected to teach their students techniques designed to limit the maneuverability of an opponent they never expected to face again, and as such Ong enjoyed an indisputable agility advantage in most battles. Only the oldest warriors and Zuko, who was beginning to develop techniques of his own through sheer trial and error, knew how to fight against an opponent who could move through the sky itself to dodge their attacks. As such, Ong was pretty confident that he could simply avoid the attacks being thrown at him until an opportunity to knock this girl out presented itself. Which was why it caught him off guard when the girl's snarling face rushed up to meet him. Airbending flight techniques were all about letting yourself go with the flow of the wind, harmonizing yourself with the natural rhythm of the world and sailing upon it to reach your destination. The technique this girl used was nothing like that. Using jets of fire spewing from her hands and feet, she forced herself into the air, defying the natural laws of gravity through her own power and will. It was a very firebender thing to do, like swimming through a tidal wave rather than surfing atop it. That didn't make it any less effective though. The golden girl collided with him mid-air, aiming to elbow him in the stomach with enough force to drive the wind out of him. On pure instinct, Ong twisted at the last second, causing the blow to knock painfully against his ribcage. It hurt, but knocking against a hard target caused the impact to push Ong out from the girl's reach. Still wincing in pain, Ong swung one arm out in a circular motion, conjuring a strong gust of wind to sweep him around underneath the golden girl and away into the direction she'd just come from. But the golden girl wasn't finished yet. Abruptly cutting off the jets of flame, she tucked her legs in and allowed herself to flip around in a lazy arc. When her momentum carried her to the wall of the opposite side, her feet found purchase against the smooth stone easily, and she bent at the knees with practiced ease to nullify the force that would have normally led to a bone-shattering crash. For a split second the kinetic force kept her pinned to the wall, almost as if she was some kind of Spider-Woman, before more jets of flame erupted from her feet as she leaped forwards again, propelling herself back towards Ong. There wasn't enough space for either combatant to fly to their fullest extent, so what followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse where they both used their respective elements to propel themselves off the walls, ceiling, and any other objects across the room. Ong swung around like a monkey, twisting and turning in impossible arcs through the sky. The golden girl meanwhile was more akin to a bloodhound, bursting forwards in quick, sharp bursts as she attempted to swipe him out of the air. From her fingers she shot small bolts of fire to try and intercept him each time he turned to evade her, and despite being a master airbender, Ong found himself only dodging each projectile by a hair's breadth. The girl's talent for aerial combat was insane. He'd have thought she had a lifetime's experience fighting airbenders if it wasn't historically impossible. It wasn't long before one bolt finally met its mark, scorching Ong's hand as he twisted to evade her charge. The pain disrupted his movement, causing the air he summoned to spiral out of his control and sent him careering down to the ground. With a horrible crunch he crashed down face first at the foot of Roku's statue, groaning in pain as the golden girl touched down gracefully behind him. How fitting! The golden girl sneered, pacing towards him like a panther stalking its prey as she conjured a dagger of flame in one hand. It was on this island that Roku perished and allowed the 100-year war to begin. Now his reincarnation will be captured in the same place, and allow the Fire Nation to finally bring it to an end. Winded and unbalanced by the impact of his crash, Ong crawled forward and propped his back up against Roku's statue, turning to face his attacker with wide eyes. The cold, ruthless glint in her gaze caused an icy grip of fear to grasp around his heart. Of course I won't make the same mistake as Zuko. The girl continued, brandishing the fire dagger above her. Clearly the only way to capture you is to cripple you enough that you can't bend. Another step, and the girl was right above him, ready to bring down with a single strike. This is the end, Avatar. Whoosh. The world turned white. Ong looked around in shock. A white fog had appeared from thin air, filling the room in the blink of an eye. No, not the room, for as he looked around Ong realized that was suddenly no longer where he was. There were no walls, no statue, and no crazy golden girl trying to cripple him. All that existed was an endless space of white, cloud-like mist. It's good to see you, Ong. What took you so long? At the sound of a voice, one his ears had never heard before, yet he somehow immediately felt he recognized, Ong turned around. There stood an old man dressed in rich red robes, his long white hair kept immaculately in place by a golden headpiece. Avatar Roku.
Thanks for listening.